100 years ago, on February 2nd, 1925, The Lost World was released to theaters. After a contentious scientist returns from a trip to South America with stories of witnessing prehistoric life on an isolated plateau, a small expedition makes a return trip with him to explore the wonders of said plateau themselves, only to realize the scientist was telling the truth all along. Now stuck on this new primordial land, the group have to survive their many encounters with the prehistoric beasts that inhabit the region. What audiences were shown on the silver screen that day would change their lives forever, because for the first time in movie history, dinosaurs were brought to life in a way that had never been seen before, to the point where people left the theaters believing the filmmakers had managed to find and record real-life dinosaurs for their picture. But in reality, it was the use of state-of-the-art special effects and stop-motion animation that would forever leave a cultural impact in not just dinosaur film history, but film history as a whole. The Lost World was the first feature-length film to use this method of special effects to this degree, and while it definitely was an impressive feat, it wasn't the only reason why it was significant. The Lost World is often considered to be the grandfather of all dinosaur films, and for great reason. Without it, we wouldn't have films like King Kong, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, Godzilla, and even Jurassic Park. The influences of this movie from 100 years ago are still very present to this day, and there's so much to its history and overall background that goes back years before its initial inception. And today, as a way to celebrate the over 100 years that we've had this film for, I want to cover as much of that story as I can. There's so many events and people attached to this story that it can be a little difficult to find a place to start. But I think the best place to begin is with the man responsible for the stop-motion animation itself, Willis O'Brien. Born on March 2, 1886 in Oakland, California, Willis O'Brien was one of the pioneers of stop-motion animation, being responsible not just for the animation seen in The Lost World, but also in other influential movies like King Kong, Mighty Joe Young, The Black Scorpion, and so on. But before he was working in the movie industry, he was just a boy who wanted to help his struggling family. Back when he was younger, O'Brien's father ran a hotel and military academy before eventually becoming Oakland's assistant district attorney. All seemed well until the early 1890s. When O'Brien was just 11, his father ended up spending the family's money on what's only been described as a series of bad business investments, resulting in them becoming poor and living in poverty. But O'Brien didn't want this for his family, so he would drop out of school and leave home to find work to keep them afloat. In the years that followed, O'Brien worked a myriad of jobs, including working on a ranch, on a chicken farm, he worked as a fur trapper for a bit, and when he was older, he also worked as a bartender. But there were a few jobs that he worked that were very significant because it would later tie into what he would become very well known for. One of these jobs was being a guide for expeditions of scientists from the University of California, which he liked very much. He would escort them to dig sites located in Crater Lake, Oregon, where they would spend their time looking for prehistoric remains and artifacts. It was here O'Brien would learn about and become very interested in dinosaurs and prehistoric life as a whole that would eventually follow him in his film career. However, as the early 1900s rolled around, O'Brien was low on finances, and whatever job he was working at this time didn't last. So he was forced to move back home, where he became a clerk for a little while at an architect's office. Though the job wasn't very fulfilling to him, so he would leave it and manage to land a job working as a sports cartoonist for the San Francisco Daily News, where he would primarily draw out boxers and prize fighters for their column. Along with being a sculptor and an animator, O'Brien was also known for his many conceptual art pieces that he drew out himself for his many film projects, a skill that he no doubt learned, or at the very least refined, during his time working as a cartoonist. This would actually inspire him to become a boxer himself, which seemed to garner a decent amount of success for a little while because after training, O'Brien would enter and fight in 9 small-time matches and won all of them. However, the 10th fight was on a larger scale, in terms of both venue and opponent. Unfortunately for O'Brien, he would end up losing this fight, making him realize that maybe he wasn't cut out for the boxing life. He would move on to his next employment ventures, including becoming a brakeman, then a surveyor for a little while, before eventually becoming a marble stonecutter for a firm in San Francisco. O'Brien was in his late 20s by this point, and on the job he would meet a coworker that also had an interest in boxing. One day at work, things were running pretty slow, so to pass the time, the two decided to make a pair of figures in different boxing stances out of clay, one figure being in a defensive stance while the other was throwing a punch. When putting the clay figures together and moving them around as if they were making motion, this ended up sparking a new idea in O'Brien's head. How impressive would it be if these figures could move by themselves? The medium was already being done to drawn pictures and film at the time, so why not physical 3D objects? In the same way, each frame of drawn animation holds a different position of the object that's then put together to give off the illusion of motion, the same could be done to a physical object. Now, one common thing I run into when I cover these kinds of older stories on early dinosaur media is that there's going to be slightly different accounts of the story. For example, Jeff Roven's book, From the Land Beyond Beyond, the films of Willis O'Brien and Ray Harryhausen, says that it was O'Brien's co-worker that was there to inspire this idea of stop motion. But another source, John M. Navroth's article titled The Lost World, Cinema's First Great Dinosaur Movie that he wrote for the Prehistoric Times magazine, says that it was actually his brother, stating, "A chance encounter with his brother helped to determine the direction he would take. After he had fashioned a pair of boxers with modeling clay, his brother playfully moved one of the arms and challenged him to a boxing match with the figures. O'Brien recognized the potential of doing the same thing, only making the figures move on film." And according to James Van Heis's book, Hot-Blooded Dinosaur Movies from 1993, O'Brien was working at the 1915 San Francisco World's Fair when he constructed the boxers out of clay, and not at the stone-cutting shop he was supposedly working at according to other sources. Which one of these is the true account, I don't fully know, but I say this for the sake of giving all accounts a chance to be heard, and because there's likely going to be more examples of this as we continue. In any case, no matter how this part of the story went, the idea intrigued O'Brien. An idea that would later be given the name stop motion, but it wasn't boxers that he wanted to show off. No, he wanted to do the impossible. He wanted to bring dinosaurs to life. O'Brien's interest in prehistoric life coupled with his newfound interest in stop motion would inspire his next project, creating a motion picture about a dinosaur. So O'Brien got to work. He created a brontosaurus and a caveman with clay and wooden armatures and contacted a friend of his, who was a newsreel cameraman, to film the project for him. When the models were finished, the two went up to the roof of a bank building in San Francisco and began filming. More specifically, O'Brien had rented out a shed that sat atop the roof of the Bank of Italy in San Francisco, using money he had saved up from working at the marble shop. It wasn't without struggle either. At some point during the process, the clay began to wane and break down from being constantly touched and moved, but O'Brien persevered, and in the end, managed to get 80 seconds worth of footage. Despite the jerky and amateur-looking animation, the film was still impressive. Eventually, O'Brien decided to take his picture to a San Francisco filmmaker exhibitor by the name of Herman Waber, who liked it so much he wanted to see a more elaborate version of it, so he put down $5,000 for O'Brien to update and expand the film. O'Brien took full advantage of his bigger budget and used it to upgrade his resources to make his film better quality, add more to it than his 80-second prototype, and to avoid previous problems. With more money, O'Brien was able to add more characters, more props, and more animals in his film, as well as create them with better materials. Since clay proved to be too much of a liability, he instead remade his models out of rubber and applied it on a metal armature instead of a wooden one. Some of the money would also go towards renting out a more suitable space to shoot the film in, the choice of which was the basement of the Imperial Theater on Market Street. In total, his new dinosaur film would take about 2 months to make, but the final product did not disappoint. Titled The Dinosaur and the Missing Link, A Prehistoric Tragedy, the film featured a trio of cavemen, Stonejaw Steve, Theophilus Ivoryhead, and the Duke, fighting over cavewoman Araminta Rockface. In the midst of their attempt to court the young cavewoman, Wild Willie, a mischievous primate, eats the group's dinner, forcing them to go out and hunt their own food. While they do this, Willie searches for more food, eventually encountering a brontosaurus by the lake, mistaking its tail for a snake. The misunderstanding leads to a brief scuffle, resulting in the bronto killing Willie, all witnessed by Theophilus Ivoryhead, who was fishing in the lake. The short ends with Ivoryhead taking credit for killing the primate, which earns him the heart of Miss Rockface. Waber saw potential in the film, and tried to sell it off into distribution, but struggled to find a company willing to do it. That is, until he showed it to the Thomas Edison Company about a year later. Formerly known as the National Phonograph Company, Thomas Edison Incorporated was the parent company to several manufacturing companies that would specialize in creating and supplying products like construction materials, electrical equipment, vehicles, and even motion pictures. These companies were established by the inventor himself, Thomas Edison, and one of the film companies he ran was called Conquest Pictures. And at the time Waber had been trying to sell The Dinosaur and the Missing Link, the Edison Company was looking to release a series of 1 or 2 real films with some educational or comedic value to them. Realizing that O'Brien's short film fit this description perfectly, Waber showed it off to the Edison Company, who loved it and released it in 1917. The film generated positive reception from the public, and when the Edison Company found out that O'Brien had made another dinosaur short film called Birth of a Flivver in 1916, just a year after he had made The Dinosaur and the Missing Link, they wasted no time buying the film off of him and even contracted him to work for them in New York. As part of the deal they made, O'Brien was to make more short films for the Edison Company, of which they would fund $500 for each one. Among the many short films he made for the company, the dinosaur-related ones included RFD 10,000 BC, Prehistoric Poultry, and Curious Pets of Our Ancestors. Though admittedly for that last one, I, and seemingly others, just assume it's dinosaur-related given the title. In actuality, it's hard to say for certain, as Curious Pets and Birth of a Flivver are lost films now. Things were looking great for O'Brien as far as creating films went, and it even seemed like he was going to go through a sort of evolution with his work, as after completing his initial contract with Conquest Pictures, there were plans to have him on to create a weekly series of educational films about prehistoric life. Something O'Brien was yet to do in his films was create a more realistic version of dinosaurs, since the ones that he had made were mainly slapstick comedies that didn't necessarily require scientific accuracy to work. But this was his chance to tackle a more serious version of dinosaurs, and it seemed like he was ready to take on that task, as he had plans to talk to paleontologist Dr. Barnum Brown, who worked for the American Museum of Natural History. Unfortunately for O'Brien, this series would end up being cancelled, a sad trend that would be seen a lot in his career, due to the fact that Thomas Edison Incorporated would shut down their Conquest Pictures subsidiary after losing a civil suit that destroyed their monopoly on motion pictures. For years, the Edison Company ran a corporate trust called the Motion Picture Patents Company, which grouped all of the film-related patents that were owned under it, which protected all sorts of motion picture technology like cameras, stock films, and raw films, since they not only manufactured this equipment, but also used it to produce their own pictures, essentially creating this massive monopoly in the film business. Of course, this made it difficult for potential competitors to become successful, since they couldn't use certain equipment necessary to make film, all because it was owned and protected by the Edison Trust. But between the successes of international films and the Supreme Court hitting the company with an antitrust prosecution case, and with no chance to appeal against said case, the Edison Company was forced to dissolve this trust. Which was fortunate for the filmmakers unassociated with them, but unfortunate for O'Brien because this event would cause Conquest Pictures to go through hard times in the late 1910s, especially since competition was now high, and eventually the company was sold to one of its rivals, a film company known as Lincoln & Parker. From the sounds of it, O'Brien could have been part of this transition with the company, but chose to leave due to the fact that he wouldn't have as much freedom with his craft as he did with Edison and Conquest, which meant he was once again out of work. However, this also wouldn't last long, as some months later, O'Brien would meet Major Herbert M. Dolly, a man that would lead O'Brien towards a new path in his career. Dolly was an aspiring filmmaker at the time that he met O'Brien, but in a more recent book by Stephen Cherkis titled Major Herbert M. Dolly, An Artist's Life, Dolly had gone through several other endeavors in his life prior to this point. He was born on March 15, 1880 in Chillicothe, Ohio, and from an early age, Dolly was very artistic in several ways. He would partake in performative arts by starring in plays and operettas as early as the age of 8. He would take an interest in drawing figures on individual pages and putting them together to make a flip book. And he would sculpt clay animals and head busts throughout his high school years. His interest in the arts would follow him after high school as he would study architectural design, but eventually change things up when he would move to Buffalo, New York to study mechanical engineering. But his love for art didn't leave him, as he would also attend the Buffalo Art Students League, and on top of this, he would continue his other interest in art by pursuing it as a side gig, including taking commission work on his off time, continuing to star in other plays from the late 1890s all the way up to 1916, and he would even go on to win prizes for some of his pieces, the first of which was the Philip Sherwood Smith Prize that he won in 1902. It would be submitting his pieces through art contests that would land Dolly towards his next career endeavor. In 1906, an automobile company called Pierce Arrow would put together an art contest, where contestants would submit a car design to them and the best one chosen by the judges would get a cash award. Initially, Dolly actually lost this contest, but the directors were unhappy with the judges' decision as they actually really liked Dolly's idea. So they implored the judges to at least have Dolly tie in first place with the other contestant and be given the same cash award. On top of this, they also liked Dolly so much that they would call him in for a meeting to offer him a position at their company company when that position would be next open. Dolly accepted, and sometime in the following year, in 1907, he would start working for Pierce Arrow and stay there for the next 10 years. During his time there, he would work his way up the ladder, being recognized for his many contributions for the company. This included designing the ornament of the archer on the hood of the vehicles, along with designing headlights that were built into the fenders of the cars, and many other things in between. He remembered his years fondly working at Pierce Arrow, including the people he worked with, the many types of customers and dealers he would meet, and the goals he was determined to accomplish for them and the company. During his tenure at Pierce Arrow, a different form of art would capture his attention. From the sounds of it, Dolly was given the task to photograph and document the company's vehicles for advertising and inventory purposes. To accomplish this, he would actually meet with Thomas Edison to inquire about his knowledge in motion pictures, to which he would use to make short films for the Pierce Arrow company. Things seemed like they were going great for Dolly, and based on his accounts, he enjoyed his time working here. But then, changes started to occur around 1916. Prior to this point, Pierce Arrow had been privately owned before the decision was made to bring it to the public. This transitional period led to many figures of the company either retiring, resigning, or being laid off. Dolly's position was no longer secure, but around the same time this was happening, Dolly would get approached by the Laidlaw Upholstery Company, which would supply Pierce Arrow with fabrics for their vehicles, and was offered a position to work with them. Dolly was even urged by his boss at Pierce Arrow to take the job, as he didn't know what the future of their company was looking like for him. So he took the job and became the second vice president and assistant manager of the limousine department of Laidlaw. But it wouldn't be long before he developed other interests. In the summer of 1917, during a trip to New York, Dolly made a stop at the American Museum of Natural History, where he was amazed by the towering dinosaur skeletons that were on display, including the Brontosaurus and the Tyrannosaurus Rex. Seeing these almost alien creatures made him wonder what they were like back when they were alive. How would they move, and how would they behave? Then the idea came to him, one that combined all of his knowledge and love of film, art, and now dinosaurs. Likely inspired by the flip books he made as a kid, coupled with his newfound interest in film photography, Dolly came to the realization that he could possibly give movements to the dinosaurs once again by applying both of these elements. Instead of drawing on paper, he would make physical models of the dinosaurs that were flexible enough to pose in different positions to animate their motions through a series of photographs that he would put together. This would be Dolly's next big project, and he was eager to start. His project would officially begin on September 3rd of 1917, where he would go back to the American Museum of Natural History to consult with the curator and lead paleontologist there, Dr. Clyde Fisher and Dr. Frederick Lucas respectively, who were more than happy to provide everything that Dolly needed in order to make his dinosaurs realistic and believable. The scientists at the museum were very encouraging of Dolly to make this movie happen, and it's likely because of this positive reassurance from the very professionals of this field that would compel Dolly to return and collect more and more data to make sure his dinosaurs were as accurate as possible for the time, and the paleontologists were very helpful in providing Dolly everything he needed. This would include allowing him in the laboratory to view fossil specimens in person to take measurements and make sketches. They gave him photographs and information on dinosaur behaviors and movements, and they would critique his eventual prototypes when he got around to making them. It would be on October 4th of 1917 when Dolly would begin the model making process, and the dinosaur he decided to start on was a Brontosaurus. And like most dinosaur reconstructions in media at the time, he would base it off the Charles R. Knight painting. He started by making a sketch of the mechanical skeleton, then went on to construct it in a way that made it very articulate so that he could manipulate it in whatever position he wanted and keep it there. 2 months later, the model was finally finished. What stood in front of him was a successful recreation of a brontosaur that was scaled down in size, only being about a foot tall and 3 feet in length. Soon, he began working on a miniature set to put the model in. While it's not concrete, it is speculated that this brontosaur that he made would also be used in the final film as well. Once the set was complete, he got his camera and began to take pictures. Instead of a motion picture camera, Dolly had a simple Eastman Kodak pocket camera that only took pictures, which was fine considering this was more of a test run than anything. Several days of slightly positioning a dinosaur model little by little and taking around 100 pictures later, Dolly had successfully finished his first piece of stop motion and officially finished on January 21st, 1918. While it wasn't in film, the pictures would be bound together in a flip book that would still show off the motion of the dinosaurs, so the concept was still there. Even though the test was a success, there was still one problem: financing the film. Dolly would crunch the numbers and deduced a full-on film project would cost around $3,000 to produce, which was money that he didn't have. But things would eventually look up once he started showing people his creation, starting with friends and family, and working his way up to even people who worked in the film business. Though, he had no luck finding any financiers. It wasn't until he showed his current boss at the time when he finally struck gold. William R. Laidlaw, the same man who employed Dolly to work at the Laidlaw Upholstery Company, would see Dolly's dinosaur flipbook, become very impressed with its contents, and would agree to finance the film. Dolly wasted no time. Once funded, he began working, starting with conceptual drawings and prototype clay models. He'd continue to pay visits to the museum and consult with the paleontologists there, who were so fascinated by what Dolly was doing, they even expressed enthusiasm to the idea of the young artist making some sort of stop-motion dinosaur project for a possible exhibit for the museum. But this only ever remained an idea, as Dolly was too invested in his film project to think about anything else. Then, on March 11th of 1918, something big would happen. Earlier, I said that Dolly first showed off his flipbook to family and friends before moving on to other people. Well, one of those family members was his distant cousin, J. Searle Dolly, who was actually a film director that, funnily enough, had also worked with the Edison Company for some number of years, and at this point, he had some pretty significant pictures under his belt. He directed the earliest known film adaptation of Frankenstein in 1910, along with A Christmas Carol in the same year. He also directed 1909's Hansel and Gretel and 1916's Snow White, the one that would actually inspire Walt Disney's later animated adaptation in 1937. It's likely his knowledge of film was the reason why Dolly approached him with his dinosaur flipbook concept, not just to get an opinion from an experienced director, but maybe also to see if he'd be interested in pursuing a film project with it, though that's just speculation on my part. However, knowing that his distant cousin was still looking to create this film, Searle Dolly had called up our Herbert Dolly one day with some information. While he wasn't working for the Thomas Edison Company at this time, Searle Dolly had heard details that a Willis O'Brien, known for his stop-motion shorts for the Edison Conquest Company, was currently looking for work, giving Dolly the idea to hire him on as an assistant. He would invite O'Brien to his studio and view some of the animation shorts he did for Edison Conquest, and while a lot of sources make it seem like Dolly was fascinated with O'Brien's work, which he probably was to some extent, according to his biography by Cherkis, he wasn't all that impressed by it. O'Brien ran 2 of his short animated movies, but Dolly was not very impressed. The animated figures were jerky and not very realistic. But just days later, on March 18th, 1918, O'Brien was officially hired and began working with Dolly on his dinosaur film project. They would pick up where Dolly left off on the dinosaur models, of which there were 4 more to make. A lot of this process was left for O'Brien to work on, though Dolly supervised very closely. It was imperative that the dinosaurs were as realistic as possible, so there were a lot of aspects that had to be changed and redone in order to fit Dolly's standard, and only then they were considered complete. Some sources state that O'Brien was also looking to make these dinosaurs as scientifically accurate as possible, as earlier I had mentioned he was working with paleontologist Barnum Brown to consult him for the educational films that never came to fruition. Apparently, he did manage to talk with Brown, and decided to not let that information go to waste, as he used it while creating the models for Dolly's film. While the exterior was largely worked on by O'Brien, the majority of the interior armature work was actually done by one of Dolly's friends, Charles Sloyder, who was a machinist. However, some pre-built armatures that O'Brien had from his previous dinosaur shorts were also used. Now that he had someone working on the models, Dolly could begin writing out a screenplay. He eventually developed the story that would become known as The Ghost of Slumber Mountain. The ball for the film really got rolling that summer, as June and July were dedicated for filming all of the scenes featuring the characters. They would use the scenic views of the Delaware Water Gap located on the border of New Jersey and Pennsylvania for their fictional setting of Slumber Mountain. And as far as filming went, Dolly and O'Brien would switch from being in front of and behind the camera, as they would also star in the film with Dolly as the uncle, Jack Holmes, O'Brien as the ghost of Mad Dick, and the 2 boys being played by a couple of kids from a neighborhood in Chatham, New Jersey, who went by Alan and Chauncey Day. The rest of the summer was dedicated to the stop-motion animation, of which both artists were heavily involved in. At least, that's the conclusion I've come to, but based on my research, the one who was primarily responsible for the dinosaur animation is very much in the air, and if you were to ask either of these artists today who had done the animation, they'd most likely give you different answers. This would lead to a lot of conflict, which we'll get into a little bit later as there's just a lot to that part of the story. How long the animation process took, I don't know for sure, but since the final stages of the film had been said to be around September or November of that year, I'm assuming they managed to get it done by late summer, early fall. When the film was complete, it would have a total runtime of about 45 minutes and a total length of 2,000 feet, which took up 2 reels. However, Dolly would end up cutting the film down by about half its original runtime, with a lot of that footage supposedly containing the dinosaur animation sequences. Some sources have stated that Dolly did this because he felt that audiences would feel bored seeing so much of the stop motion in one showing. But according to his biography, this has more to do with an agreement that he made with the manager of the Strand Theater in New York. Dolly brought the film to the Strand Theater and screened it to a Mr. Walter Hayes in the hopes of getting his approval to have it screened there for public viewing. Hayes told him that he could play his picture at their theater if Dolly agreed to cut the film down to 1 reel. Not wanting to pass up the opportunity, Dolly agreed and had his 45-minute film cut down to about 20 minutes. And to this day, that 20-minute version is the only one that exists, with many believing the rest of the footage to be lost to time. That being said, it is rumored that some of these leftover dinosaur sequences were actually recycled for a later film that Dolly would make and release in 1920 called Along the Moonbeam Trail. We'll get to that film later though. Once finished, The Ghost of Slumber Mountain was released later in the year in New York on December 17, 1918 by World Pictures. The film revolves around a pair of kids who pester their uncle to tell them a story, to which he happily obliges. He tells his nephews a story about a pair of men and their dog venturing to a mysterious mountain to camp. During their trip, they run into a strange cabin that belonged to an old hermit that used to live in it, where he would walk out with a strange device that he would peer through during the day sometimes. The two continue on their way, but that night, one of the men awakens to a voice luring him towards the cabin. Upon breaking in, he finds the shelter empty, with nothing but models, books, and fossils of prehistoric creatures. He also finds a box that contained the strange device, and when he takes it out, it summons the ghost of Mad Dick, who coerces him outside and urges him to look through the device. When he does, he realizes he's peering into a prehistoric world, one roaming with all sorts of ancient animals, including a brontosaurus that wanders into a nearby swamp, a diatryma that snaps up a snake, and a pair of grazing triceratops that soon lock their horns in battle. But suddenly, the head of a fourth kind of reptile appears through the trees, a Tyrannosaurus rex. The giant dinosaur emerges from the brush and attacks the victorious Triceratops, which leads to a brief battle that the horned lizard loses. Soon, the T-Rex's sights are on the man, who runs away as fast as he can. Even shooting at the dinosaur proved to be useless, causing the man to run all the way back to camp and continue shooting at the dinosaur before he awakens from what turns out to be a very crazy dream. It was a very unique movie for the time. It was the first movie to really portray the scientifically accurate dinosaur and was the earliest to pull them off using stop motion to this degree. And speaking of the dinosaurs, the film would also feature the first appearance of a new dino star, that being the Tyrannosaurus Rex. Prior to this picture, T-Rex had never been featured in film before, and its debut couldn't have been better executed. In turn, this also makes it the first on-screen fight between the Tyrannosaurus Rex and the Triceratops, two of the most iconic dinosaurs portrayed in media, often in battle, that would be replicated for several decades to follow. It was the first dinosaur picture to have live actors interacting with stop-motion dinosaurs, though not in the same frame. But the way the film is edited gives off the illusion well enough, especially for the time. The Ghost of Slumber Mountain would go on to become a huge success. Not only did it get a lot of press coverage from the media, but Dolly also worked to promote the film using striking cover art to portray the prehistoric animals that featured in it, and even gave out sets of lobby cards from art and stills of the dinosaurs from the film. This marketing would pay off, as the film would make around $100,000 against its $3,000 budget. And of course, the most praised aspects in reviews at the time were of the stop-motion animation for the dinosaurs themselves. However, the issue with all of this press coverage is that Dolly is mentioned a lot, but O'Brien is hardly recognized. In fact, in most retellings of this story, it's often stated that Dolly even went as far as taking the credit for all of the animation work done for the dinosaurs, when, according to O'Brien, his role in animating the animals was actually pretty minimal. And that sucks because The Ghost of Slumber Mountain was a step up from O'Brien's previous stop-motion endeavors. Unlike his slapstick comedies, the dinosaurs are portrayed very seriously, which is what he wanted to pursue with them, as they lack the humorous qualities seen in his previous films, engage in a brutal fight with each other, and overall act more like real-life animals. It was certainly an ambitious project, and one that would pay off. However, he was barely mentioned. As a result, O'Brien would cut ties from Dolly and move on to different projects, which would eventually lead to The Lost World. As I said earlier, this is in most retellings of the story, but the situation isn't that black and white, and there's a lot more that happened between these two artists, so much so they get their own dedicated segment. However, we're going to pause a bit on O'Brien and Dolly's story to focus on a different yet extremely important aspect of this story, the source material for The Lost World. So I've talked a lot about the person behind the Lost World movie, but I haven't spent too much time on the movie's source material. Let's go back in time a little bit. Originally, The Lost World was a 1912 science fiction novel written by author Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I've talked about the Lost World novel in previous videos already, which is why I didn't start off with it in this one, and is also why I won't spend a whole lot of time explaining it here. But to summarize, the book itself is extremely influential and is arguably the most important piece of paleomedia in the world. Not only did it spawn the 1925 movie, but the book itself was responsible for the popularization and labeling of the Lost World subgenre. The concept of discovering an uncharted area of the world that oftentimes contains some sort of ancient civilization or prehistoric life. Sure, it definitely wasn't the first of its kind to do a story like this, especially when you have works like Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth novel that was written all the way back in 1864. But Doyle's novel definitely gave the subgenre its name, and there's been plenty of media that have since used this concept in one way or another because of The Lost World. Doyle's writing endeavors didn't just come from a place of fiction and fantasy. Some of his earliest writings were dissertations and essays that he wrote for medical journals, because on top of being an author, he was also a physician. He would attend the University of Edinburgh Medical School, where he would earn his bachelor's in medicine and master of surgery in 1881. His knowledge of medicine would bleed into his writing career, as it would appear in many of his stories, including his most influential one, 1887's A Study in Scarlet, which would feature the first appearance of Doyle's most famous character, Sherlock Holmes. According to the Britannica article on Doyle, while a medical student, Conan Doyle was deeply impressed by the skill of his professor, Dr. Joseph Bell, in observing the most minute detail regarding a patient's condition. This master of diagnostic deduction became the model for Conan Doyle's literary creation, Sherlock Holmes, who first appeared in A Study of Scarlet, a novel-length story published in Beeton's Christmas Annual of 1887. Holmes would become very popular amongst audiences, which in turn led Doyle to write more stories about him both as shorts and full-length novels. At some point, Doyle grew tired writing about Holmes and even attempted to kill him off, but due to popular demand, he would be brought back for future stories. It's also worth noting that Doyle was also a big proponent of spiritualism, which may seem strange as he was often considered to be a strict man of science, especially in his Sherlock Holmes stories. But in truth, Doyle had a great interest in the supernatural, and even participated in seances and pondered about the idea of life after death. He even joined communities dedicated to researching the topic. For example, in 1889, he joined the Hampshire Society of Psychical Research, and in 1893, he joined the Society of Psychical Research. This likely played a role in his eventual creation of the Lost World. The supernatural very much opens the door to other mysteries of our world, including cryptozoology, which, based on some readings, it appeared Doyle had an interest in this as well. One figure that Doyle was especially interested in was an explorer by the name of Percy Harrison Fawcett. Fawcett had taken many trips to South America in the hopes of uncovering its many uncharted and mysterious regions. These expeditions led to claims of encountering a large Apizaka spider, shooting a giant 62-foot-long anaconda, and the existence of the lost city of Z that he would make attempts to find, but would inexplicably disappear in 1925 during his final trip to look for it. Before his disappearance, he actually collaborated with Doyle on some of his literary projects, one of them being The Lost World. On February 13th of 1911, Fawcett would give a lecture about his adventures and discoveries in Bolivia at the Royal Geographical Society in London, a lecture that Doyle had attended and was very much impressed with. During this lecture, he would mention the Ricardo Franco Falls, which is connected to a flat-topped mountain region that was likely the inspiration for the dinosaur-roamed plateau that would later feature in Doyle's story. Fawcett would later write about these events that were gathered and put into a 1953 book published after his death called Exploration Fawcett, where he stated, "Above us towered the Ricardo Franco Falls. Flat-topped and mysterious, their flanks scarred by deep quebradas. Time and the foot of man had not touched those summits. They stood like a lost world, forested to their tops, and the imagination could picture the last vestiges there of an age long vanished. Isolated from the battle with changing conditions, monsters from the dawn of man's existence might still roam those heights unchallenged, imprisoned and protected by unscalable cliffs. So thought Conan Doyle when later in London I spoke of these hills and showed photographs of them. He mentioned an idea for a novel on Central South America and asked for information, which I told him I should be glad to supply. The fruit of it was his Lost World in 1912, appearing as a serial in the Strand magazine and subsequently in the form of a book that achieved widespread popularity. Another interest that Doyle would develop that played a huge role in his eventual Lost World story was the dinosaur boom of the early 1900s, often considered to be the earliest example of dinomania. Prior to this point, dinosaurs weren't very well documented and their fossils were too fragmentary to make a full reconstruction. However, by the turn of the 20th century, an abundance of new specimens had been discovered, thanks largely to the petty feud between rival paleontologists Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope, in what would later become known as the Bone Wars that lasted from the 1870s to the 1890s. The two scientists were in competition to see who could uncover and describe the most specimens, and it was during this event where many species of dinosaurs that are well known to the public eye were discovered, and ones that would later be used in Doyle's novel and/or its subsequent film adaptation. These dinosaurs included Stegosaurus, Brontosaurus, Allosaurus, Brachiosaurus, Triceratops, and so on and so forth. By the early 1900s, many of these dinosaur skeletons were put on display in museums. This in turn led to more efforts being put to finding more specimens, which ultimately led to the discovery of the most well-known carnivorous dinosaur, the Tyrannosaurus rex. Soon, a dinosaur craze overtook the general public, and Doyle was one of many that was inspired by the giant ancient lizards. The Lost World served as Doyle's chance to be able to write about something other than Sherlock Holmes, and to explore his other interests of exploration and prehistoric life. This time, he could write about a different character going on a different adventure. He would come up with the character Professor George Edward Challenger and wrote about his adventures to the Amazon basin in search of a plateau that's been said to house ancient creatures that no modern man has ever seen. None but one, that being Maple White, an American explorer who managed to find a way onto the plateau and document his findings, but was now dead. Challenger plans to continue where White left off and prove the existence of these prehistoric animals. Challenger would be joined by three others: reporter Edward Malone, rival scientist Professor Summerlee, and famous explorer and hunter Sir John Roxton, who are all going for their own reasons. Each of these characters were based off of real-life figures. Challenger was based off of both Percy Fawcett and physiologist William Rutherford, who was one of Doyle's professors at his time in Edinburgh. Malone was based on the human rights journalist Edmund Dean Morell, who would advocate against slavery and used his platform to expose the unfair and abusive powers of the Congo Free State. Doyle actually supported the activist group that Morell established, which was called the Congo Reform Association. Morell was partnered with Irish diplomat and fellow human activist Roger Casement, who was the basis for John Roxton's character. Casement would later rebel against the British government during World War I in an attempt to establish an Irish republic, but was captured and hung for his crimes of treason. And finally, some sources have claimed similarities between Professor Summerlee's character with that of Scottish toxicologist Sir Robert Christison, another professor of Edinburgh that Doyle knew of. Once Challenger and his small expedition make it on the plateau, it becomes a survival story, as the group not only have to avoid flesh-eating dinosaurs, but also find themselves in the middle of a war between two tribes that inhabit the region, one made up of indigenous people, and the other made up of cannibalistic ape men. Through it all, our band of characters are able to survive and escape the plateau. And on top of it all, Challenger is able to leave with live evidence of the prehistoric region in the form of a young pterodactyl. In the next public meeting, Challenger shows off his finding, which ends up getting loose and flies around London, with many suspecting it to be heading back to its homeland. The story would initially be serialized through several different newspapers throughout 1912. But most notably, it was published and serialized in the Strand magazine, a British magazine that mainly featured short stories and articles on other areas of pop culture and entertainment. The story would go on to become a big success, and it would lead to decades upon decades of adaptations and works that were inspired by the original book. And of course, the most influential one is 1925's The Lost World. But as you can probably already guess, it took some time for this film adaptation to happen. And initially, there were a couple of attempts to turn this book into a movie even before First National got their hands on the rights to it. The first ever attempt was made from motion picture pioneer William Selig. While there doesn't seem to be a clear date or record of how things went down with the discussion Selig had with Doyle, we do know that he did, at one point, hold the rights to the film adaptation of the novel. Because even though the film didn't get far at all, there are some records of its existence that managed to be preserved thanks to the Margaret Herrick Library of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences in Beverly Hills, California. These records include a summary of some notes, a few storyboard drawings, and a cast list. According to the synopsis, the story starts with a Gladys White, who's anxious to hear from Professor Challenger, as he had just returned from South America with a manuscript that belonged to her now dead father, Maple White. Upon arriving, Challenger discusses the matter with Gladys, Professor Summerlee, and Lord John Roxton at a library. During the discussion, Challenger explains the reason for Maple White's trip to the Amazon, which was to prove the theory that when the floods had occurred all those years ago, they formed a giant whirlpool, the center of which was likely lower than the outer rim of the world. This would mean that whatever land sat in the center of the whirlpool was spared of the disaster, which likely still held the original inhabitants, which were speculated to be prehistoric animals. Maple White had been studying this whirlpool and was able to deduce its center to have been located somewhere in South America. While Challenger seems to be convinced of White's work, Summerlee thinks it's nothing more than a story. While this is happening, Gladys meets with her boyfriend, Eugene O'Brien, who had come to meet her with the intent to propose, though she begs him not to, considering everything that's happened with her father. His theory had been mocked in the press, and wanting to protect his legacy, she takes it upon herself to go to South America to prove her late father's theory correct. She then announces her intentions and dares the 3 other men to go with her to see for themselves as well. Challenger and Roxton seem eager enough, and after some convincing, even Summerlee tags along. This was the only scenario of the film that was really fleshed out this far. Everything else seems to be notes regarding changes to be made to the story elements of the movie from the book. For example, Gomez's character was planned to be present in this iteration, and like his actions in the book, he was going to betray the group and leave them stranded on the plateau. Instead of being killed by Roxton like he was in the book, he manages to escape back to England and becomes famous for being the only survivor in the Challenger expedition. Towards the end of the film, he was to speak at a public scientific meeting before our characters revealed themselves to still be alive, leading to his arrest. The movie would end with Gladys agreeing to marry Eugene. And while there wasn't anything written about what was to happen on the plateau, there are a few surviving storyboards that give us an idea. One features one of the characters trying to scare off an attacking theropod dinosaur with a torch, likely meant to be one of the scenes kept from the book where Roxton scares off the Megalosaurus with the fire. Another storyboard features a female inhabitant of the plateau showing one of our characters a pair of sauropods, likely Diplodocus, grazing nearby. And finally, the last one shows one of our characters encountering a large terror bird. How these animals would have been brought to life, we have no idea, but I actually like some of the elements this version was going for. I especially think the biblical stuff would have been interesting to hear about, but plans fell through. It's not concrete how it all went down exactly, but it's suspected that the reason for why the film was canned was due to Selig's film company, the Selig Polyscope Company that he started in 1896, was going through hard times during the transitional period of motion pictures of the late 1910s. Films were becoming longer and more expensive to make, and because of the tough competition, Selig shut his company down in 1918, taking his version of The Lost World with him. At least, partially with him. Because in actuality, a lot of Selig's vision would end up being realized in First National's adaptation of The Lost World. The inclusion of a female character, the romance subplot, the theropod attack sequence, and even some of the cast that they had planned would make it into the 1925 version's final film, including Lewis Stone as Roxton and Bull Montana as the Ape Man. It's likely that when First National did eventually gain the rights to The Lost World, they also obtained all of Selig's leftover ideas that he had for his adaptation and decided to select certain parts of it that would work for their own script. Whatever the case may be, it was likely the liquidation of Selig's company that led to the film's cancellation, especially when you take into account that the rights for it would be purchased in just the following year. According to the film book Hot-Blooded Dinosaur Movies, Doyle would sell the rights for a movie adaptation of his novel in 1919 to a British film producer J.G. Wainwright for £500. Who this Wainwright person was, I'm not entirely sure, but they were apparently going to make this Lost World film through their film company Cine Productions Limited, but nothing ever came from this for reasons that I've yet to find. Sometime later, a film producer by the name of Watterson Rounds Rothacker would purchase the option from Wainwright. Rothacker initially started out as a journalist in Chicago before trying his hand in film during World War I. And during his filmmaking ventures, he would establish the Industrial Moving Picture Company in 1916, which he used to process and experiment different areas of film that haven't been explored before, like sounds, aerial photography, and even stop-motion animation. It was likely through his filming experiments that, in part, caused him to want to try and approach more ambitious projects. So he managed to secure an 8-year deal with Doyle himself for the film rights to his Lost World novel, which I'm assuming means the time frame in which they have to make the film. So the story in which, when and how Rothacker actually gained the rights to the Lost World and met O'Brien has fluctuated, and different sources have said different things. In Hot-Blooded Dinosaur movies, it's written as if Rothacker had the idea to obtain the rights after he hired O'Brien. The reason that Rothacker became interested in the Lost World was the fact that Willis O'Brien had come to work for him, and he knew that with O'Brien's expertise that a major production of Doyle's novel was now possible. In The Land from Beyond Beyond, it's written to make it seem like a coincidence that Rothacker had purchased the rights to the Lost World film before working with O'Brien. The Lost World, a Professor Challenger novel written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle in 1912, is about the discovery of living dinosaurs on a time-forgotten plateau in South America. It was a natural vehicle for stop-motion special effects. Obie told Rothacker that it was the most elaborate special effects production in the history of motion pictures. Coincidentally, the producer owned the motion picture rights to Doyle's novel. And other sources, like Herbert Dolly's biography, state that O'Brien had met Rothacker as early as during the summer in which he and Dolly were producing The Ghost of Slumber Mountain. While the details vary, at some point down the line, Rothacker would eventually meet O'Brien, and together, the two were going to make history. They were to embark on the first steps to making the world's first feature-length dinosaur movie. But, as you can imagine, it wasn't without its struggles. The quarrels between Dolly and O'Brien would lead to a feud that would last for multiple years after the release of The Ghost of Slumber Mountain, and very much overlapped with O'Brien's involvement with the Lost World. Over the decades, there have been many sides of the story that has come to light, whether it's coming from the perspectives of the people who were directly involved, or from the perspectives of film historians that recorded this feud with the research materials they were working with in their respective points in time. But not very often are these sides presented all in one place. Which is why I've decided to dedicate an entire segment of this video to compile everything that I've found and put together in a way that's as chronological as I can possibly make it. My ultimate goal is to simply present each side of the story. You can take this information how you please and come up with your own conclusions after hearing them out. Now earlier, we heard O'Brien's side of the story that's been recorded in many film history books and articles that's talked about his film career. In these many retellings, O'Brien is often portrayed as doing the majority of the effects for Slumber Mountain, and thus the film is often considered to be his work. Subsequently, he's also portrayed as a victim who was unfairly taken advantage of by Dolly's greed when his credits were revoked from the film. But now it's time we looked at things from Dolly's perspective. The first thing you have to know about this situation is that Dolly and O'Brien didn't work well at all together. Despite having multiple common interests in art, stop motion, and dinosaurs, these two were simply not compatible. Dolly specifically had been pretty vocal about his thoughts on his time working with O'Brien that paints a different picture about the well-known animator and recorded materials that he would later write. To fully understand the story, we have to go back to when these two were still working on The Ghost of Slumber Mountain, specifically during the summer of 1918 when they were working on the dinosaur animation. According to Dolly, O'Brien wasn't the easiest man to work with, as he would fail to listen to Dolly at times and his work would come out sloppy. One example that was recorded in Dolly's biography was an incident where Dolly had to leave for a short period, leaving O'Brien in charge of some of the animation work. So one thing about Dolly that I haven't mentioned yet is that he actually had an interest in the military and joined the New Jersey State Militia in 1917. However, it functioned similarly to that of the National Guard, where they stayed close to home but were still on call for military duties when the time came. Well, he was still active in the military when he was working on The Ghost of Slumber Mountain with O'Brien, and at one point during the animation process, Dolly had to leave for a military call for a short period and left O'Brien alone to continue the animation work. When his duties were finished and he arrived at the studio, Dolly was upset to see that O'Brien had made 100 feet worth of film, which was about 65 seconds, that was apparently so poorly done that it couldn't be used. As a result, O'Brien wasn't allowed to work on the animation anymore, at least not while being supervised by Dolly closely. I then went into the studio and took active charge of the work, doing the animation while he turned the crank of the camera. From then on, he did not do anything without my actual presence at the time, or without my having first planned the action and by frequent inspection directed its progress. Even the proper lighting of the set was a result of my arrangement. I know this sounds like Dolly was very much micromanaging the process, which would be annoying to anyone, but when you consider this was also very much a passion project of his that he invested both time and money in, it's understandable why he would be frustrated with O'Brien for messing up. It also shows that O'Brien may not have been as competent of an employee as some people think him to be. And this was just one example of Dolly's experience working with O'Brien. According to the text, at various times during the production of the movie, Dolly found it difficult to work together because of O'Brien's poor workmanship and insubordination. Many decades later, Dolly recalled that O'Brien was clever, but erratic and undependable. He'd get paid on Saturday, and many times he would either have spent it or lost it by Monday. As far as how O'Brien felt, it was apparent that he wasn't happy working with him either, and was looking for different outlets of work even before the release of The Ghost of Slumber Mountain. It would be around this time when O'Brien would meet Rothacker, and their newfound partnership would prove to cause even more headaches for Dolly. But before we get into that whole mess, we should first look at the most documented part of this feud. It all came to a head on December 17th, 1918, the day The Ghost of Slumber Mountain was released. In one of the previous segments, I had mentioned that Dolly had removed all of O'Brien's credits from the film in what seemed to be a deliberate move. But in truth, like a lot of other parts of this story, it varies depending on the source. Looking at it from another angle, opposing retellings have stated that O'Brien's name was removed because it had been put there, presumably by O'Brien himself, while Dolly was away. And when he came back and saw it, he was so angered by it that he removed his name entirely and continued to give himself full credit. And because of this apparent lie that Dolly was spreading, O'Brien decided to sever his ties with him and move on to something else. I mean, it's an understandable move by O'Brien, right? Surely, since he did the majority of the work, he should get full credit for it, right? Well, the story was a lot different from Dolly's perspective. According to the biography, back when Dolly was to cut down and edit the film to feature in the Strand Theater in New York, something much more important came up once again on October 4th, 1918, that being his military duties. This time, it was an emergency, as what was considered to be one of the largest munitions storage facility called the T.A. Gillespie Company Shell Loading Plant in the neighborhood of Morgan, New Jersey exploded, causing live ammunition to fly all over the surrounding area. For the following 2 days, blasts from high-grade explosives like mines, grenades, and bombs would go off, destroying property and endangering nearby residents. Dolly was called in for the next 8 days to help evacuate and house the now many homeless people of the neighborhood, along with dealing with looters and an influenza epidemic that just so happened to be spreading the same week the explosions occurred. During this whole ordeal, Dolly was given little to no sleep, so when he was finally allowed to go back home, he understandably wanted to take that time to rest. As a result, he not only delegated O'Brien the task of cutting down the film to his desire, but also to get the playbill for the film printed, which was the theatrical poster. O'Brien agreed to do it and eventually finished it, and Dolly was so grateful, he gave O'Brien a bonus and even allowed him to use whatever film was left over for future projects of his own. However, it seems O'Brien would take advantage of Dolly's generosity. At this point in time, he was in the talks with Rothacker, at least according to Dolly's biography. As I mentioned earlier, the story about how and when he and Rothacker actually met varies depending on the source. But as far as Dolly's perspective goes, he tells of another incident in which O'Brien proved to be untrustworthy in his eyes. During his meetings with Rothacker, he'd show the producer the short caveman comedies he worked on for Edison Conquest. Impressed, Rothacker wanted to see more, and requested for O'Brien to make about 200 feet worth of footage that could further show off the potential of his craft. Instead, O'Brien would proceed to take film negatives from Dolly's studio to show to Rothacker without the permission of Dolly himself, who wasn't very happy when he heard about this. What's worse is that apparently the footage that O'Brien showed Rothacker was footage of the then unreleased Ghost of Slumber Mountain picture. Rothacker was very much impressed with what he saw and had plans to hire O'Brien to work with him in Chicago. But when Dolly found out about O'Brien taking his film, O'Brien's justification for showing Rothacker the reel was that the negatives he took were mixed up with the ones that he meant to take. Dolly requested the negatives back, and while I don't know for sure what the outcome of this specific incident was, I think it's implied that O'Brien and Rothacker respected Dolly's decision, prompting Dolly to not pursue any kind of action against them. Also, I don't know for sure when this incident happened in regards to the timeline of the overall story, but I'm putting it here to illustrate what would eventually cause the tension between Dolly and O'Brien. And keep in mind, this was before he knew anything about what O'Brien did for the film's playbill. Cut to the film's premiere, and Dolly is faced with something that he is greatly displeased with. O'Brien's name was listed as the producer of the film on the playbill. When you consider everything that Dolly did for the film compared to the work O'Brien contributed, it makes sense why he thinks O'Brien doesn't deserve this credit at all. And Dolly didn't see this as an accident on O'Brien's part either. To him, this was done on purpose. Dolly at one point stated, "I was disposed at the time to feel that O'Brien would act in good faith as an employee of mine who had been accorded considerable more courtesy in the publicity that he was entitled to. Subsequent events proved that this assumption on my part was wrong." He would proceed to retaliate by removing O'Brien's credit on the film entirely. From here, the two went their separate ways. Whatever relationship these two had was now forever torn. Dolly went on with his life, and O'Brien continued to work with Rothacker. An announcement was later made around August of 1919 that confirmed Rothacker and O'Brien had been working together. He made this announcement through his company, and as the text reads, "For some time, Willis H. O'Brien, the man who produced the novelty effects in The Ghost of Slumber Mountain, has been in our employ, and is now engaged in producing a number of novelty pictures which we know to be very effective and attractive and far more superior than anything Mr. O'Brien has previously done. Regarding those novelty pictures, some sources have assumed that they were made and were just lost to time now, but others suspect this was nothing more than a way to divert attention away from O'Brien's fight with Dolly, and they were never actually made. As we continue the story, you'll see that the latter was more than likely the case. So one thing to know about Rothacker during this whole O'Brien versus Dolly arc of the story, he too was not very happy with how things transpired between the two artists, or the treatment he believed O'Brien was given. It got to the point where, when he was giving his public announcement about his partnership with O'Brien, he'd reference the situation regarding The Ghost of Slumber Mountain, basically calling Dolly out. When this picture was presented at the Strand, Mr. O'Brien was given full credit for its production. But since then, an attempt has been made to create the impression that the work was not done by him, which of course is contrary to the facts in the case. Mr. O'Brien is constantly improving his unique process which we control. Now, how much the producer actually knew of the situation, I have no idea. It's possible that O'Brien only disclosed enough to make himself look like a victim and Dolly look completely awful, making Rothacker truly believe he earned the credits for Slumber Mountain. Or it could be a case of Rothacker just being a businessman, seeing the feud as a marketing opportunity and using it to his advantage. Or maybe it was a little bit of both. It got to the point where the two essentially went on a hate campaign against Dolly, and I kid you not, even tried to prevent the wide release of Slumber Mountain in 1919. It was around May of that year when Paul H. Crommelin was in the talks with Dolly to distribute his successful dinosaur picture. At the time, Crommelin was the president of the Inter-Ocean Films Company, and he was interested in working with the artist and filmmaker. However, an affidavit written by Rothacker was sent to him. Within its contents were the claims stating O'Brien was actually the one to have worked on the majority of the effects for Slumber Mountain, and that Dolly was essentially trying to steal from them. Along with this, a series of ads and announcements came out from Rothacker in various publications that continued to spread word about his claims that O'Brien was responsible for the effects seen in Slumber Mountain. Despite the constant attempts to overwhelm Dolly with these accusations, he didn't back down. In fact, he would counter these ads, announcements, and the affidavit with his own letter that he sent to Crommelin that covers the situation from his perspective. That's why we have all the information I've been telling you throughout this whole segment. Everything regarding his experience working with O'Brien, the Slumber Mountain incident, and everything else in between was written in his letter to Crommelin. And fortunately, at least judging from how things continued, Crommelin had believed Dolly, and the move to try and get the wide release of Slumber Mountain cancelled had failed. But if you thought that's where this part of the story ends, then you probably didn't notice the runtime of this video. After this point in time, the two would go their separate ways, but it wasn't long before Dolly and O'Brien were once again fighting over visual effects credits. And it somehow gets even messier. At some point during the meetings between O'Brien and Rothacker, the idea of a Lost World motion picture was discussed. As I mentioned at the end of the previous segment, it's a little up in the air on how this went down specifically. However, one version of the story that I found very interesting was the one where O'Brien gave Rothacker the idea for it. This version of the story actually came from Dolly's biography as well. When O'Brien told Rothacker that he could make motion pictures of dinosaurs, he was asked to make a better example to prove his point. Rothacker also asked O'Brien if he had any story that would be suitable to use with his animated dinosaurs. The story that he presented for Rothacker was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World. The thing is, given this version of the story is true, and O'Brien was the one that gave Rothacker the idea to make a Lost World motion picture, then that means the idea wasn't actually originally his. Because the biography continues to explain that O'Brien actually got the idea for doing this adaptation from Dolly himself. So, going back even before the production of The Ghost of Slumber Mountain, and around the time O'Brien agreed to work on a dinosaur picture with Dolly, O'Brien had moved into the Chatham neighborhood where Dolly was from to be closer to work. Here, he would meet magazine writer Chester F. Bray, who just so happened to be Dolly's friend as well. Bray and O'Brien would become more friendly throughout that summer while he was working on Slumber Mountain, and one day he overheard a conversation between Bray and Dolly. With how things were going with Slumber Mountain's production, Dolly likely realized the many doors of opportunities and ideas it would open for the future. And he had discussed one of these potential ideas to Bray, a very ambitious one, to ask Doyle for the motion picture rights of his Lost World novel. O'Brien was fascinated with the idea, and sometime later approached Bray about the possibility of writing a story that O'Brien could adapt using his dinosaur models. Bray turned the idea down, possibly due to his own schedule, and instead gave O'Brien the idea of adapting stories that already existed. He even gave O'Brien a couple of titles he could work with, the first of which included 1905's The Flying Death by Samuel Hopkins Adams, that's about the region of Montauk Point, Long Island being terrorized by an unseen terror in the skies, later revealed to be a pterodactyl. The second book he suggested was 1912's The Lost World by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. At this point in time, O'Brien had never heard about this novel, but once he was given a synopsis of the story, he would seek out a copy to read himself. He would eventually find one while he was in New York City, presumably sometime that summer, read it, and greatly enjoyed it. That autumn, O'Brien would meet up with his friend Bray once again, and during their conversation, he'd bring up his newfound interest in Doyle's novel, and even brought up his own plans to approach the author for the motion picture rights for it. And when you take consideration in the fact that he was also in the talks with Rothacker throughout the same summer as well, he likely realized he was already one step ahead of Dolly and could beat him to the punch on actually making a Lost World film adaptation, since he already had a man that worked deep in the industry and had a lot of connections. Of course, that's just speculation with the given materials I've read, but it really wouldn't surprise me if it was revealed this is how O'Brien brought up the idea of doing a Lost World movie to Rothacker. And when you look at the timing of everything regarding the rights to Doyle's novel, it makes sense. Earlier I had mentioned that filmmaker William Selig had the rights to a Lost World motion picture adaptation, but most likely lost those rights after his company, the Selig Polyscope Company, became defunct in 1918. Multiple sources have stated 1925's The Lost World was a 7-year project, meaning this project likely started around 1918 or 1919, which is often referenced as the year J.G. Wainwright had obtained the film rights to the novel. If The Lost World was a 7-year project, then that may imply Rothacker got involved during this point in time, and maybe attempted to negotiate or buy out the rights from Wainwright. Of course, like I've said so many times already, this part of the story gets a little fuzzy, so I couldn't tell you exactly when Rothacker obtained the rights to The Lost World. The book, Hot-Blooded Dinosaur Movies, throws out a 1922 date as the year when Rothacker secured the rights, but other events throughout the story may or may not contradict that date. Eventually, when Rothacker would make some progress, he not only obtained the rights, but also took the proposal to the major motion picture studio First National. It's not entirely clear when this happened either, but some records state that it happened during or before 1920, a couple of years before he would supposedly obtain the film rights. It's possible he didn't have the film rights at this time and simply pitched the proposal to First National, and they liked it so much, they worked to help Rothacker obtain the rights, which maybe happened a couple of years later in 1922. I don't fully know if that's how it went down, I'm just speculating with what I'm working with here. Regardless of the date, the more I read up on the Rothacker-O'Brien partnership and their plans for the Lost World, the more I began to realize why they went through so much trouble to flame Dolly. Again, it's very possible O'Brien was withholding crucial information about his feud with Dolly, but at the end of the day, Rothacker was first and foremost a businessman. And when he saw O'Brien's ability to recreate dinosaurs, he definitely saw potential in creating a Lost World motion picture. The problem is that, for the sake of securing investors, he wanted it to appear that O'Brien was the only one who had this ability to bring dinosaurs back to life for film. It makes sense. The concept was new, and when there's a new concept, there's always going to be someone who wants to exploit it before others try their hand at it. Because once more and more people are shown to also possess the same ability as you now have competition. Exclusivity makes you special and in high demand, and that was a real intention behind these ad campaigns. To make O'Brien appear as the one who actually did the effects for Slumber Mountain, and Dolly as the man who was trying to steal O'Brien's work and pass it off as his own. This is further corroborated by the fact that Rothacker never even tried to get in contact with Dolly to get his side of the story. From what I'm picking up from all of this, he simply didn't care. The move to keep this movie from getting a wide release was made to give them more control over this narrative. That way, they seem special, and they can get the profits to fund their next big project. And this would work, eventually. In February of 1920, Rothacker approached Robert Rubin and Louis Mayer of the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Pictures Corporation in the hopes of selling a contract for the movie for $9,000 plus 1/3 interest in the production and distribution of the film. Despite being interested at first, the two would lose interest after First National declined this contract and would leave the project. Several months later, in June of that same year, First National's general manager, J.D. Williams, would approach film producer and investor Catherine Curtis with the opportunity to back The Lost World. Originally starting out as an actress for a brief period, Curtis would start her venture into the film industry playing the lead female role of the now lost 1919 silent film The Shepherd of the Hills, before eventually moving on to becoming one of the world's earliest female film producers. In the same year in June, she would establish the Catherine Curtis Corporation, dedicated to producing motion pictures. And during her time with this company, she had only produced 2 films, including Love Never Dies and The Sky Pilot, both released in 1921. In the following month from being given the offer from Williams, specifically on July 8, 1920, Rothacker would make a deal with Curtis, who had agreed to produce their Lost World film under the belief that O'Brien was the only one who knew how to create dinosaur models for stop-motion animation. Now, at this point in the story, there's been a lot of information thrown out there as to when Rothacker obtained the film rights to The Lost World, but according to records that were archived by the Catherine Curtis Corporation that documents the whole event from their perspective, J.G. Wainwright had purchased the rights on September of 1920. And Curtis had apparently signed this contract to work with Rothacker without 100% confirming whether he had obtained the rights or not. But she worked with this, and it actually seemed like there was a brief period where Curtis was not only exchanging ideas between both Wainwright and Rothacker, but she was also in the talks with William Selig to get him to still work on the film as a producer. However, this fell through as her and Selig couldn't figure out a deal, and he was being too difficult to work with anyway. And I'm assuming this was also around the time Wainwright and Rothacker came to an agreement regarding the rights, leading to Rothacker purchasing it from them, working out in Curtis's favor. Another part of her job as the investor was finding a credible director for the film. She managed to get in contact with Thomas Ince as a potential director, who was a very prolific filmmaker from the silent film era, having literally hundreds of movies under his belt during his time in the industry. As interesting as a project seemed, Ince requested to see footage of what the dinosaurs might look like on screen. During this point in time, Rothacker and O'Brien were being very sketchy, at least from Curtis's perspective. While Rothacker seemed interested in the money she was offering, it's almost as if he was never willing to commit to her on the project. When it seemed like she wanted to do more in terms of producing the movie, he wouldn't let her do it, but would be willing to change his mind if she provided them the funds in cash. And the documents even state that his unwillingness to commit himself on paper became a problem between the two parties, and things weren't looking any better on O'Brien's behalf. When Curtis approached O'Brien with the request to view some of his previous works in stop motion, he was rather dodgy at first, coming up with poor excuses to not show her. You'd think if Rothacker had claimed in those previous announcements that he and O'Brien had already worked on a few novelty pictures together, then he'd have something to show to Curtis. Unless this means they actually didn't create anything and just used that to distract people from the truth of the situation, but I digress. When O'Brien's excuses eventually ran out, he would end up showing her the footage from The Ghost of Slumber Mountain. Curtis seemed concerned at O'Brien's lack of credits within the film. Even though he tried to reassure her, she couldn't help but pay attention to the credit that did show up on the film, Herbert Dolly. Curious, Curtis would track down Dolly and had a meeting with him in February of 1921, where he would first learn about the Lost World film adaptation that Rothacker and O'Brien were planning to make. His reaction to this news was never described, but I can imagine he wasn't thrilled to hear about it, especially since he likely picked up immediately that they were, at least in part, making it because O'Brien overheard the idea from him. Regardless of their plans, at the time he was approached by Curtis, Dolly had just completed his more recent film project, Along the Moonbeam Trail, just a year before in 1920. Along the Moonbeam Trail was yet another whimsical adventure picture that stars Dolly as the leading role of the uncle of his two nephews, played once again by Alan and Chauncey Day. The trio are out camping before Uncle Jack tells them about Queen Mab, a fairy that possesses magical powers that visits you in your dreams. That night, as the three doze off into a deep slumber, Queen Mab appears into the woods nearby. She frolics over to the campsite and awakens the trio, announcing herself and granting them one wish. Seeking adventure, the kids wish for a magical airplane to fly them to the moon. Their wish is granted, but before they go off, Queen Mab gives them a magic ring that, when rubbed, will summon her in case they get into any trouble. With that, the trio board the plane and fly off into space, where they make all sorts of encounters, including the God of War, who is now an intergalactic traffic cop, the man on the moon smoking a cigar, and Mother Goose, who races them on her broom. A run-in with the God of War almost lands them into trouble, but they maneuver their way out of that situation and continue on their adventure, where they then encounter the 7 Daughters of Atlas dancing together. Suddenly, they're attacked by a pursuing pterodactyl, described as the Hobgoblin of the Skies in the film. The almost dragon-like pterosaur chases our characters through the depth of space before they crash land on a distant planet. Once on the ground, our characters head to cover to escape the airborne monster. On their trek, they find a cave to seek temporary refuge in, and just in time too, as not long after, another prehistoric animal emerges from the brush. This one being a stegosaurus, which is interestingly flickering its tongue like a snake. The stegosaurus eventually leaves the area, and in its place, a trachodon emerges and grazes on the vegetation. Suddenly, the stegosaurus reappears and menaces our characters from the mouth of the cave, but once again wanders off. All the while, the trachodon continues its grazing before it's disturbed by an intruding Tyrannosaurus Rex. The trachodon doesn't back down, and even attempts to fight the T-Rex, but ultimately loses the battle. The scene is too much for the kids, and they rub the magic ring summoning Queen Mab. One of the boys wishes for them to be home, safe and sound, to which the fairy grants, and they all wake up in their beds happy to be done with their exciting adventure. Like Slumber Mountain, Along the Moonbeam Trail was another film under Dolly's belt that would reach a significant accolade in filmmaking. It was the first film to put stop-motion dinosaurs and live-action people within the same frame. This was done using the double exposure method, in which the live-action sequences are shot first, the tape is rewound, and on the second round of recording, the dinosaur sequences are animated alongside the previously recorded footage. The cave entrance is actually a miniature that was positioned in a way that faced the set in which the dinosaurs were to appear on, and the inside of the cave was a set for the live-action characters. Once processed, the footage shows human characters on screen at the same time as the dinosaurs, which is an important milestone for dinosaur film history. And it was done primarily by Dolly with the added help of his father, John Dolly, who was living with them at the time, and artist Charles C. Horn, who helped through 9 months of the film's overall development. All of this information, as well as the film itself, have actually been lost for decades, and it wasn't until much recently everything that I'm talking about right now has come to light. How the film became lost, I don't really know. Dolly implied the film didn't do very well financially, so my only guess is that he just never screened it again and put it into storage. From there, it fell into obscurity, but unfortunately, this also began several untrue rumors about the film that ties into the drama between Dolly and O'Brien. I mentioned one of the rumors earlier, that being the cut footage from The Ghost of Slumber Mountain was actually reused in Dolly's later film Along the Moonbeam Trail. Well, when it was believed that O'Brien did the majority of the effects for Slumber Mountain and that the cut footage from Moonbeam Trail was repurposed from its predecessor, that meant it featured dinosaur animations that were done by O'Brien, meaning he technically did the effects for Along the Moonbeam Trail. Again, this was untrue, as all the effects in Moonbeam Trail were unique. But the reason why this rumor went on for so long is because it wasn't until 2014 when the film was revealed to have finally been found, and reveals that O'Brien had nothing to do with the film's development. The story behind the rediscovery of Moonbeam Trail is actually really cool, and yes, that means I'm about to derail this video again. The man responsible for this was Stephen Cherkis. I've talked about Cherkis on the channel before. He was a prominent figure in the world of dinosaur enthusiasts, as his fascination for paleontology inspired his many ventures in life, including working on stop-motion special effects for films like 1977's Planet of Dinosaurs, sculpting full-scale dinosaur models for museums and exhibits, and even co-founding his own museum simply called the Dinosaur Museum that's located in Blanding, Utah. One day, Cherkis found himself at an auction bidding on a photo that caught his attention, a bid that he would win. The photograph was of a man constructing a dinosaur model, a trachodon to be more specific. There was something about this image that called out to him. There was a story behind this picture and he very much wanted to know what it was. Little did he know at the time just how extensive this story would end up being. As you can already guess, this picture was of Dolly himself, and the dinosaur he was working on was not from his better-known Ghost of Slumber Mountain picture, as this specific dinosaur was never featured in that film. Cherkis wanted to know more, and began researching what he could about the artist. In the process, he would learn about a performing arts theater that Dolly co-founded in Chatham, New Jersey called the Chatham Community Players Theater. Dolly had been a director at this theater for nearly 50 years, starting all the way back in 1922 and ending in 1970, the same year he would pass away. Cherkis decided to contact the theater and was greeted over the phone by a Chris Furlong, the theater's president. After discussing his current fascination with the theater's former director, Furlong agreed to look around for Cherkis to see if they could find any records of his life. Admittedly, Cherkis wasn't expecting much, but less than a couple of days later, he was contacted by Furlong with great news. They searched the attic of the theater and managed to recover Dolly's entire life. Stored in the attic were piles of photos, clippings, documents, scrapbooks, and even film reels that contain various pieces of information on Dolly's life. Information about his personal life, his art projects, his films, his relationships, all of it was there. The most exciting part of this discovered collection was no doubt the film reel that featured dinosaurs on it. This was it. This was a long-lost Along the Moonbeam Trail movie. However, this specific reel only contained the second half of the film, featuring all of the dinosaurs. Luckily, the first half had been preserved and was archived at the British Film Institute. The film, among many others that Dolly had produced, were donated to the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, who would go on to combine all known parts of Moonbeam Trail to make a near-complete version. I say near-complete because the ending for the film is still missing, which is the part where the kids rub the magic ring and wake up safe in their beds. Regardless, this was truly a remarkable find. Along with everything else, Cherkis also found documents and letters that recounted Dolly's experience working and later feuding with O'Brien. These records told a much different story, the one I've been telling you guys so far, and with this newfound information on hand, Cherkis took it upon himself to set the record straight. In January of 1982, Don Shea, author and founder of the Cinefex movie magazine, wrote and published an article in the 7th issue detailing O'Brien's life and film career. Unbeknownst to him at the time, he had echoed the same misinformation many others had prior to him, about how O'Brien was the victim to Dolly's greed. A little over 3 decades later, when it was brought to his attention that this was no longer an accurate retelling of the story, Shea was determined to right his wrongs and invited Cherkis to write an article for Cinefex explaining all of the new information he found about Dolly's life, including his disputes with O'Brien. In July of 2014, in the 138th issue of Cinefex, Cherkis' article titled O'Brien vs. Dolly was included, which, to my knowledge, is one of, if not the first published instance of this story to have been released to the public. What's more is that Cherkis found so much about Dolly's life as a whole, he would bound it all up together as chronologically as possible, and in 2016, created the Herbert Dolly biography that I've referenced several times in this video. I can't emphasize enough how much of a help these two pieces of literature have been for this video, as without them, it simply would not be complete. In the context of the story regarding Dolly and O'Brien that I derailed, sorry for that, Dolly was more than happy to show Curtis this footage, and she was no doubt impressed with the film, and upon seeing it, along with Dolly's name in the credits, she came to the realization that O'Brien and Rothacker were lying to her. O'Brien was not the only one who could animate dinosaurs, as Dolly proved to her. This went against the contract she signed with Rothacker, but she gets even more frustrated with the situation after she notices something else about Dolly's film. When the title and credits for the film appeared on screen, so did a patent identification number. When asked about it, Dolly revealed that he, almost a year prior on February 26th of 1920, applied for a patent for his articulated dinosaur armatures and was approved on July 27th, 1920. Seeing how Moonbeam Trail was also released in 1920, I assume he got this patent to protect his newest film and avoid similar conflicts he faced with Slumber Mountain. Upon learning about Dolly's talents with stop-motion dinosaurs, Curtis was initially angry with Rothacker and O'Brien for lying to her and going against their contract, and she even fired O'Brien from the project. But this didn't really solve anything, given her very difficult and unique situation. Dolly held the rights to what he described as articulated effigies, but Rothacker held the rights to the Lost World film adaptation. Curtis could fire O'Brien and try to replace him with Dolly, who was still interested in working on a Lost World film adaptation, but Rothacker was very loyal to O'Brien and wouldn't agree to work with Dolly. She even mulled over the idea of having Dolly and O'Brien work together, but O'Brien wasn't on board with this plan either. No matter what she tried to suggest, no one could agree on anything. This went on for over a year. In that time, Rothacker and O'Brien tried to continue work on the Lost World by working around Dolly's patent, presumably with the help of First National. Okay, so this segment went on for a lot longer than I thought it would, and the worst part is, their rivalry doesn't end here. It very much bleeds into the story of the Lost World's development, and I will continue to talk about it, but a few very key events also took place during this point in time that I really don't want to overshadow. Because at the end of the day, no matter what was in their way, Rothacker and O'Brien were determined to reach their goal, making the world's first feature-length dinosaur film. When O'Brien was first brought to the Brunton studio, which was owned by First National, he met with a team of people that included special effects artist Ralph Hamaris, department head Jack Fredman, producer Earl Hudson, and others I'll talk about more later. Starting with O'Brien, of course, he was in charge of the dinosaur animation. But along with that, he also did a lot of other jobs, including overseeing some of the miniature sets, and explaining the animals that were to feature in the picture to the cast and crew to give them an idea of what to expect when it came down to filming and directing everything else around them. And of course, in order to animate the dinosaurs, they had to be created first, but before long, it became clear that O'Brien's workload was just too much for him to handle on his own. To top it all off, along with his responsibilities at the studio, O'Brien took it upon himself to attend night classes at the Otis Art Institute in Los Angeles to refine his modeling skills in preparation for the more art-heavy aspects of the job. While he was attending these classes, he would meet a young, aspiring artist by the name of Marcel Delgado. Delgado, born January 16th in 1901, was exposed to art at a young age, first becoming fascinated with it when he was 6, where he would witness a local artist sculpting religious figures in his hometown of La Parida, Mexico. This would spark a new passion for the young Delgado, one that would come in and out of his life due to several unexpected and rough turning points that would cause delays. The first major one was in 1909. Delgado's family would flee from La Parida to escape the Mexican Revolution and find a new home in Los Angeles, though things weren't that much easier there either. Along with facing discrimination due to their ethnicity and language barrier, Delgado's family could only find work through farm labor. The next major turning point was only a couple of years later in 1911, when Delgado's father would suddenly pass away, forcing the young boy to leave school and find work to support his struggling family. His teen years were spent working whatever jobs he could land, but somewhere down the line, he set a goal for himself. He wanted to pursue a career in the arts, and work towards that goal he did. By the age of 19, which was around 1920, he was working as a grocery clerk for $18 an hour. But on the side, he had been attending classes at the Otis Arts Institute where he would revisit his prior passions and learn how to sculpt and model. On top of this, Delgado had to work for the school as a tutor, as he couldn't actually afford to take this class. So he worked out a deal with the school where he would work for them as a tutor to some of the students in exchange for taking the class for free. This is where Delgado would meet O'Brien. O'Brien was impressed with his modeling skills, and once he got the okay to hire someone to help him out in the studio, he would offer Delgado to come work for him for $75 a week. But the aspiring artist initially turned the offer down. Delgado stated during one interview, "Yeah, I turned him down I don't know how many times. It didn't interest me at all. He didn't know what I could do then, he just met me. Every day he saw me, he said, 'You want to come work for me?' I says, 'No, I already have a job.' I turned him down several times until he mentioned the studio. That was the beginning of it. I started right there." There were several reasons why Delgado turned O'Brien down at first. The biggest seems to have been that he wanted to stick with his goal of becoming an artist, and felt that taking this job for O'Brien would delay that goal. It's also due to how unreliable these Hollywood productions could be. Constant executive interference and budget constraints that would affect his creativity and freedom, along with causing him unnecessary stress, didn't seem appealing to the young artist. But O'Brien wouldn't take no for an answer. "Yeah, so I told him I already had a job, I turned him down." Finally, after so many times, why, he said, "What are you doing tomorrow, Saturday?" "Well, I don't have to work. Why don't you come to see me at the studio?" "Well, I'd never been to a motion picture studio. I thought it would be a good chance for me to go in, take a peek." On that day, O'Brien gave him a tour of the studio, which ended at the stop-motion workshop. At this point, Delgado was impressed, and more excited at the prospect of working with O'Brien. And it was all as well, because at the end of the tour, O'Brien once again offered Delgado the job, telling him, "It's yours if you want it." Well, that day he took me to a nice little place he had all fixed up for me, and he says, "How do you like your studio?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, this is your studio if you like it. If you want it, it's yours." Well, that's what I'd always dreamed about. I said, "Thanks." He said, "When are you going to start work?" I says, "Right now." And with that, Delgado was officially on the team, and his first job was to make the dinosaurs. We'll get more into his process that he used to make the models later. But with Delgado's skills in model making and O'Brien's skills in stop motion, the two would eventually create the first instance of footage for The Lost World. This was actually test footage of the dinosaurs that O'Brien had created that included some of the models that Delgado had made, like the Triceratops and the Tyrannosaurus Rex. Well, sometime after, in the summer of 1922, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle would go on tour to the United States to give lectures about spiritualism, and in June he would make a stop at the Hotel McAlpin in New York City. Here, a banquet was being held for the American Society of Magicians, and in attendance were popular names for the time like Leo Rollman, Horace Golden, Robert Heller, and Harry Houdini, who was both a chairman for the society and a friend of Doyle. In fact, Doyle was apparently the guest of honor for the banquet and was invited by Houdini himself. Little did the members of the society know, Doyle had some magic of his own that he was going to show everyone. At around 1 o'clock that morning, Doyle was announced to the audience and called to the podium. As a projector and screen were being set up behind him, he delivers this monologue. "If I brought here in real existence what I show in these pictures, it would be a great catastrophe. These pictures are not occult. This is psychic because everything that emanates from the human spirit or human brain is psychic. It is not supernatural. It is the effect of the joining on the other hand of some power of materialization. The imagination, I may say, comes from me. The materializing power comes from elsewhere." With that, the projector ran, and the film played. What the audiences saw that night were dinosaurs, moving around and alive on screen. And what's more, no one, not even Houdini himself, could figure out how Doyle was able to pull this off. But as you already figured out, this was actually the test reel that O'Brien put together. When it was shown to Doyle, he was so impressed by it, he decided to take it with him on his tour and pull a prank on the magicians. And to keep the prank going, Doyle refused to answer any questions after the film was done playing. The whole scene was so mind-blowing that it even caught the attention of the New York Times, who would write and publish an article about the whole thing in just the following day on June 3rd. The news headline read, "Dinosaur Cavort in Film for Doyle. Spiritist mystifies world-famed magicians with pictures of prehistoric beasts. Keeps origin a secret. Monsters of other ages shown, some fighting, some at play, in their native jungles." The article not only goes on to explain the events of that evening, but even describes some of what was featured in the film. Monsters of several million years ago, mostly of the dinosaur species, made love and killed each other in Sir Arthur's pictures. Prehistoric brutes that resembled rhinoceroses magnified many times, equipped with enormous horns that pointed forward like those of the unicorn, drove dinosaurs away from feasts on one another. One monster, like a horned toad of monumental proportions, presented an impenetrable surface of armor plates to attacking reptiles and moved along in safety. I think what's so great about all of this is how unique the whole scenario is. Sure, this might seem silly to us now, but when you take consideration in the fact that this was the first ever public reveal of the Lost World movie, and the fact that people hadn't ever seen dinosaur effects of this quality, and the fact that dinosaurs weren't as well documented back then as they are now, the reaction was so real and genuine, and that's something that we could never replicate again. It wouldn't be long before the truth came out though. Just the following day, Doyle would break the #1 magician's rule and reveal his secret. He wrote a letter to his friend Houdini explaining how the film was accomplished, saying, "The dinosaurs and other monsters have been constructed by pure cinema, but of the highest kind, and are being used for the Lost World picture that represents prehistoric life upon a South American plateau. Having such material at hand and being allowed by the courtesy of Watterson Rothacker to use it, I could not resist the temptation to surprise your associates and guests. I am sure they will forgive me if for a few hours I had them guessing." The New York Times would get a hold of this conversation between the two and publish a new article in their papers on June 4th, titled, "His Dinosaur Film a Hoax, Says Doyle." However, there's something else this article points out in its headline. And now, his screen production is threatened with suit by inventor. This inventor, of course, is referring to Dolly. Given the exposure this event had, it wasn't long before Dolly eventually caught wind of it, and when he did, he wasn't very happy. Shortly after hearing about it, Dolly would pursue in a $100,000 lawsuit against Rothacker and O'Brien, claiming the pair were infringing on his articulated effigies patent, which was technically true. Reports show that Dolly claimed O'Brien had learned the methods of stop motion during his time working for him. Of course, this wasn't entirely true. While O'Brien learned a lot working with Dolly, this obviously wasn't his first venture with stop motion and produced films before Dolly did. From here, the story often goes that Rothacker and O'Brien would win the case by collecting records and documents from previous projects, as well as obtaining statements from people that have worked with O'Brien personally to prove that he had been doing stop motion animation long before working with Dolly. With all this material against him, Dolly was forced to settle out of court. And some of this probably did happen, however, there's more to the story than that. As shown in the previous segment, Dolly knew of the Lost World's development long before the New York Times article on Doyle's showcase of the test footage, and for the couple of years between those 2 points in time, there was a standstill in the movie's production. And as a result, nothing, at least to my knowledge, had been revealed publicly about the Lost World movie during that period, which was likely what Dolly wanted until they found a way to figure out the dilemma. What Dolly likely didn't know was that, in the meantime, Rothacker and O'Brien had been working on this test footage with the articulated dinosaur models. It was only when this test footage, using his articulated effigy patent, was finally shown to the public that launched this whole lawsuit against Rothacker and O'Brien, because it revealed to Dolly that they were in some way proceeding to make the Lost World film using his patented methods. And the way this was all resolved was not as clear-cut as some retellings would make it out to be. Records from Dolly's personal writings would reveal the tail end of this lawsuit. Dolly had written about this particular segment of his life years after the events in his diary. In fact, it was when O'Brien died later in November of 1962 when Dolly would recollect his experience working with and fighting against O'Brien that would end with the eventual lawsuit. Next to a cutout of O'Brien's obituary, Dolly would write out this statement. O'Brien worked for me during the filming of The Ghost of Slumber Mountain. O'Brien left me upon completion of the picture and went to work for a Mr. Rothacker in Chicago, claiming authorship and all other credits for the work. He had heard me tell a friend that I was going to try and get the rights to the Lost World. He told this to Rothacker, who hopped a ship and beat me to the punch. He didn't know that I had secured a basic patent to the method of manufacturing the figures. So for several years, I prevented the making of the film. Finally, Rothacker made me an offer, and I licensed him to go ahead. The Lost World was a financial failure, as were the others of that nature. The Ghost of Slumber Mountain had milked the novelty. Now that O'Brien is dead, I hope the controversy died with him. I made another picture about dinosaurs, and it too was a financial bust. Not to spoil the story of the Lost World's development, but Dolly's statement in regards to it being a financial failure was incorrect. But I digress. The part that's important to the context of the story is that Rothacker had to pay to legally use Dolly's patent in order to proceed with making the Lost World. Why he agreed to this deal, it's never really been stated. Maybe what Rothacker offered was too good to pass up, maybe Dolly was just tired of fighting and saw no real way to be a part of the Lost World's production. In any case, this marked the end of the conflict between Dolly and O'Brien. That said, this wasn't the end of the lawsuits. At this point in the story, Catherine Curtis had had enough of this whole conflict between both parties, especially after hearing Dolly pursuing in legal actions against O'Brien and company. So she also threatened and eventually filed a lawsuit against O'Brien and Rothacker for going against their contract and lying to her about O'Brien being the only one to have the ability to create stop-motion dinosaurs. Apparently, around this point in the story, she had already invested a significant amount of money in the production, specifically $35,000 by her account. And now, it seems all of that money was for nothing if her business partners couldn't hold up their part of the deal. There was even a point where it almost looked like Dolly and Curtis were going to team up to make their own Lost World movie. If Dolly's claims are substantiated, she will ask him to take charge of the filming of a picture which has hardly been begun after 2.5 years' work by Rothacker. However, it's possible this was intended as an empty threat towards Rothacker in order to get him to make a move. But regardless, Dolly was still interested in working with Curtis, even sending her letters on what the cost of the film's production would be should they go through with these plans, and promising her that she would have his permission to use his patents without worry of legal troubles. But the problem hadn't changed, that being the fact that Rothacker still owned the rights to the novel's motion picture adaptation. Ultimately, the two would never see this project through, as Rothacker, sometime in mid-1923, was able to take control over the film's production with the help of First National. While I don't know for sure what ended up happening specifically, it was reported that Curtis was essentially kicked off the project after Rothacker was made to be the film's new producer, meaning they had no reason to keep Curtis around. That, and First National was likely not pleased with the fact that Curtis was suing the people heading one of their productions and felt this was the easiest way to handle the situation. Whatever the case may be, this too marked the end of the long standstill with the movie's development. So now being free of these obstacles and officially getting the go-ahead to start production, Rothacker and O'Brien now had a new obstacle: making The Lost World. The Lost World was a combined effort of multiple talents. While the dinosaurs are the main stars and are one of the main aspects that's kept the film in conversations today, there were many other elements that, if absent, wouldn't have made it as successful as it ended up being. These include the sets, the shots, the story structure, the methods used to bring the dinosaurs and the actors in the same frame, and so on. There are some sources who imply that when O'Brien was employed by Rothacker, they didn't start production on the film right away. In fact, it's mentioned in a quote I read out earlier, they actually produced a few shorter film projects before they decided to move on to something more ambitious. And if I were to guess, it was likely working on these few novelty pictures, as they were described in that quote, where Rothacker saw O'Brien's process in action and became convinced the idea of making a feature-length Lost World movie adaptation was possible. Given this was the order the events played out, of course. Apparently, 3 or 4 of these novelty pictures were completed but have been lost to time. That being said, some sources question their existence and that it was more of a marketing ploy to tide people over until they could get out their much bigger and, at the time, secret project. Considering how they've been so far in the story, I'm inclined to believe the latter was likely the case. In any case, the decision to produce the Lost World movie was eventually greenlit by First National, and production was to start in Burbank, meaning O'Brien had to move from the East Coast all the way to California for this picture. Once there, Rothacker started setting up the pre-production phase, including figuring out the financing, getting the effects team together and ready to go, starting the casting process, and so on and so forth. From the sounds of how Rothacker was working, it seems that he really wanted to make history with this film, willing to spend a lot of money to make it as elaborate as it can be. It's almost as if the moment he saw O'Brien's work, he realized their studio could be contributing to a new era of motion pictures. This is corroborated by the fact that his goal was to spend over $1 million on the picture. With a project this big, O'Brien found himself in a position where he was going to need more help with the dinosaur models. That's where Marcel Delgado came in. Delgado's first order of business was to make the dinosaur models, but there were some obstacles that he had to overcome. For starters, even though all of the materials he needed were provided to him, he wasn't told how to make the models. I never knew anything about it, about what I was going to do. He never taught me how. He used to make these animals himself, but when I started, I didn't even ask him. He didn't even bother to tell me about it. In fact, I think he was just trying me out to see what I can do. And I started from the very beginning. I didn't know nothing about it. So I started to experiment with this, and before I knew it, I was building them. Which I feel I did pretty good for a beginner. Delgado would end up doing what most people did during that time when they wanted to recreate a dinosaur in any format. He would refer to the paleo art of Charles R. Knight. Well, I referred to, by that time he had the pictures of Charles Knight, you know, the artist over there at the museum in New York. He had photographs of drawings of Charles Knight. I like those, and I referred to those all the time. I made a copy of them. So it happened that what I didn't know, I studied. I mean, right there and then. I tried this, and if it didn't work, I tried something else. When he got an idea of the designs he wanted, he got down to making the model. He was given metallic ball and socket armatures made of steel and duralumin that were designed by O'Brien, which would serve as the dinosaur skeletons. He used sponges for their flesh and muscles, carving them into the shapes he wanted before attaching them to the armature. He would then cover the flesh with a layer of latex material that would be used as the dinosaur's skin. Some dinosaurs, like Stegosaurus, Triceratops, and Agathaumas, had added accessories like plates and horns that were attached to their models separately. And to really add to the realism, the dinosaurs were given saliva and spit, and even blood for sequences when they were shot by the characters or mauled by other dinosaurs. Glossy shellac was used for the saliva, and chocolate syrup was used for the blood. And one of the most impressive details that's often pointed out about the dinosaur models is that some of their interiors were fitted with a football bladder that could inflate and deflate from air that was passed through a valve that was hidden from the cameras, giving off the appearance that the dinosaurs were breathing. Delgado would create a total of 50 dinosaur models for the picture, and when he was done with them, they would range from 16 to 20 inches in length. These dinosaurs and prehistoric creatures would include Brontosaurus, Tyrannosaurus, Triceratops, Agathomus, Stegosaurus, Trachodon, which is sometimes referred to as Edmontosaurus in some sources, Brachiosaurus, which are shown running away during the volcano sequence and was even attacked by a Tyrannosaurus in that same scene, Allosaurus, Pteranodon, and even a Toxodon, which makes a very brief appearance as the Pteranodon's prey before it falls off the cliff. For the time, this was the most diverse roster of dinosaurs that's been displayed in film. Delgado definitely had his work cut out for him, and he wasn't done yet. He was to stay on set after pre-production to repair any damages that the models sustained during the filming process. As mentioned before, realism was something that O'Brien was heavily trying to focus on when it came to the dinosaurs in this film. That means they not only had to look realistic, they also had to move realistically. When it came down to the stop-motion animation, it took O'Brien 14 long months to produce and complete. Within those 14 months, O'Brien worked 10-hour days, mostly in isolation, to avoid distractions, as that could have caused him to forget which part of the animal he needed to move next, which could have potentially caused inconsistencies within the animation. Each day, O'Brien would accomplish about 480 frames of film, spanning to be about 35 feet of film, and would result in a runtime of just over 30 seconds. He seemed very particular about the animation process, as many sources claim that, with the exception of the dinosaur stampede scene later in the movie, O'Brien did all of the stop-motion animation for The Lost World himself. Some do speculate that this is hard to believe given the sheer amount of work that went into it. According to the Lost World segment in the dinosaur filmography, for years it was assumed that O'Brien himself performed all of the Lost World animation, with the possible exception of a few stampede shots. But the discovery of the aforementioned lost footage has cast doubt on this. The very thing that caused many of these shots to be outtakes was the fact that the animator had been accidentally photographed for a single frame, and Obi is not among the gentlemen caught inadvertently by the lens. Moreover, the production slates identify the sequence animators by name. One interesting name that shows up is Roop, a somewhat unusual surname that surely must refer to J.L. Roop, the credited animator for Bray Studios' 1928 parody The Lost World. And along with J.L. Roop, more names have also emerged from the technical team that likely helped O'Brien out with the stop-motion sequences. These names include Homer Scott, J. Devereaux Jennings, Hans Konekamp, and Vernon L. Walker. Whatever the case may be, it was a very long, time-consuming, and no doubt at times tedious job. But through it all, O'Brien and his team got it done. And the final product looks amazing. Not only were they able to complete a sequence as large-scale as a volcano scene, O'Brien also managed to complete more elaborate and challenging shots too. For example, a scene that features a pteranodon flying about with a freshly caught meal. The way they were able to accomplish this was to use piano wire that was tied from the flying reptile to a brace that hung over the set, and with the right lighting, they were able to make the wire seem invisible when they began shooting footage of the animal, ultimately giving off the illusion that it was flying. The hard work paid off, as the dinosaurs of the Lost World, at least for the time, felt so real. And this is largely due to how they decided to depict the dinosaurs. There are many aspects to appreciate about the dinosaurs, but to start, they were very much ahead of their time. While most dinosaurs during this point were considered slow and dumb, O'Brien opted to make his much more active. As a result, there are several sequences of the dinosaurs battling each other, hunting each other, and roaming around the plateau. Even dinosaurs like Brontosaurus is seen walking on land, fighting with the Tyrannosaurus, and rushing away during the volcano sequence. If you know anything about older paleontology, you'll know that around this point in time, scientists were of the idea that sauropods were too big to walk on land, and would spend most, if not their entire lives, living in swamps and lakes, as the buoyancy of the water helped support their massive weights. Of course, this would later be seen as an outdated idea, but The Lost World was one of the pieces of paleomedia that countered that idea at the time it was relevant. There's also a scene where what I'm assuming is supposed to be an allosaur attempts to take down a trachodon, but the duck-billed herbivore doesn't go down without a fight, which is rare to see in hadrosaurs and other plant-eating dinosaurs, as in more recent times they're often used as nothing more than weak carnivore fodder in media. Here, the trachodon puts up a fight, and there's little details with the dinosaurs' behaviors and movements that really make them feel like animals. For example, during the Allosaur-Trachodon fight sequence, there's a moment where the two are fighting, but then they pause for a moment, before one of them makes a move that continues it, which is something that you see in normal animal fights. It's as if they're taking a moment to plan their next move without getting hurt, before they're suddenly interrupted when one of them finally strikes. Then when the allosaur wins the fight and starts feeding, it eats its food very bird-like, and even licks and cleans its claws. There's a moment similar to the Trachodon fight when the Allosaurus then attacks a family of Triceratops and gets hurt during the encounter. Rather than being this unstoppable force that just keeps attacking the ceratopsids, it pauses for a moment to assess the damage it's been dealt, before ultimately doing the sensible thing and walking away from the fight. Even more animalistic behaviors are portrayed later in the film in the aftermath of the eruption, where we see a pack of what I think are the Allosaurs opportunistically feasting on the carcass of a dinosaur that presumably died during the disaster, which is something you don't really see in these older dinosaur flicks. And some dinosaurs like the Brontosaurus and the Tyrannosaurus rex even have facial expressions that allow them to snarl at each other. All of this was done using the stop-motion method. However, there were a few instances, specifically during the Brontosaurus rampage scene in London, where full-scale props of the dinosaur's tail, foot, and head were made for more interactive encounters with the live actors. This includes a scene where the Brontosaurus swings its tail into a crowd of people in the middle of a London street, when it nearly stomps on a woman during its rampage before being stopped by being shot at by another passerby, and when it sticks its head through a building window, surprising a group of men playing cards. For the ending scene, where the Brontosaurus falls through the London Bridge into the River Thames, which they accomplish by simply pulling the dinosaur off with a piece of wire, and swims out to sea, they recreated a model of the Brontosaurus that was inflated on the bottom so that it could float on the surface of the water. They then tied a piece of wire to the Bronto that they pulled, making it look like the dinosaur was swimming. To really sell the scene, a miniature boat was made and placed in the background. As far as the dinosaur designs went, The Lost World set a new bar for their overall appearance. But what adds to the scenes even more are the amazing miniature sets that were built for the dinosaurs. While O'Brien and Delgado were in charge of the dinosaurs, Ralph Jimenez and his crew were in charge of the settings. Jimenez was originally from Minneapolis, but moved to Los Angeles in his early 20s in the hopes of becoming a film artist. And in a way, he succeeded in this goal, as this would eventually lead him down a path to film special effects, which is an art form of its own. He would eventually get a job working at Brunton Studios, and when The Lost World would begin its pre-production phase, Jimenez was invited by producer Earl Hudson to work on some of the special effects. The idea seemed intriguing to him, especially after hearing that he would be working alongside Willis O'Brien. Another reason I signed the contract was because Mr. Hudson told me that he had a man by the name of Willis O'Brien, who did the most unusual things, like making prehistoric animals come to life on screen. He said he thought we would make a good combination and working on a picture he was going to make called The Lost World. Jimenez would work with a large crew of 125 technicians to build these sets, which consisted of miniature jungles and city streets of London. As far as the jungle settings went, they were fitted with all the necessary props needed to make it look realistic, including added foliage, boulders, sand, and so on. All of which were carefully scaled to look like the correct size to fit the dinosaur models. They were working on a 75 by 100 foot shooting stage that many of the miniature sets sat on, and the miniature sets themselves would be about 6 feet long and 3 feet tall. According to Jimenez, we built our miniatures on tables or platforms about 3 feet above the floor. This was done so that O'Brien could be in a more comfortable position when he was working. The miniature sets also had to be built shallow in depth, so that O'Brien could reach into the set without disturbing any of the foliage while animating. When the sets were ready, the dinosaur models were put in place, and to keep them stable, especially at points during the filming process when the dinosaurs had to be moved in positions where they were completely unbalanced and couldn't be held up on their own, holes were drilled under the set where screws would be fastened into pre-drilled holes that were under the dinosaurs' feet. When the dinosaurs were in a position where they were off their feet entirely, like when they're falling, rods and wires were used to keep them in place. This gave them a lot more freedom to be able to move the dinosaurs in the active ways they wanted to, and when they were done with those holes, they'd be covered with some of the props within the environment, like sand or some of the foliage. And speaking of foliage, some of the vegetation were actually made from sheet metal that were cut and shaped to look like ferns and leaves. This was to make sure they couldn't move during the dinosaur animation process, especially since it could have potentially ruined some of the continuity. One of the most elaborate of the miniature plateau sets had to be the one made for the volcano sequence. For starters, it was one of, if not the biggest set made for the movie, spanning 75 feet by 150 feet. Then there was the volcano itself, which stood 5 feet tall from the ground. To accomplish its effects, a hole was cut out from under its crater, where light and smoke would be shown and piped through to give off the appearance that it's active. For the final sequence of the film of the Brontosaurus rampaging through the streets of London, miniature sets were also created, one of them having a building that the sauropod was to destroy. To accomplish this, the pieces and debris of the building were pulled about using wire. The dinosaur animations aren't the only impressive aspects when it comes to The Lost World. Another impressive aspect is how they managed to put both dinosaurs and live actors in the same frame. There were several techniques that were used to make this possible. Given his time working in this field, Hemeris became a specialist in a technique that would be used in The Lost World, that being the glass shot, which he apparently patented. The glass shot is when certain elements of a scene are painted on a large pane of glass that stands in between the camera and the set of that scene to make it look like those elements are in the foreground of the shot. Glass and matte paintings were also used for background elements to save money on building full-on sets. A couple of matte techniques were used as well, including the static matte shots and the traveling matte shots. Static shots, as the name implies, were used during points when the dinosaurs and the characters were stationary. A piece of glass with a section blacked out is put inside a matte box that's then attached to the front of the lens of the camera. That blacked out portion is where the dinosaur is meant to be. The filmmakers proceed to film the live action sequences of the characters with that blacked out piece. Once they're done recording, they'll take a counter matte painting, which is a piece of glass that has everything else blacked out except for that spot where the dinosaur is meant to be. That piece of glass is then put into the matte box, and the reel that the filmmakers used to record the actors is rewound and rolled again to record the dinosaurs. Once finished, you get something that looks like this. For shots that required movement and changes of positions from either the characters or the dinosaurs, the traveling matte shot was used. This method was more complex than the static matte, as it involved what was basically a very early version of green screening. Except instead of a green background, the characters and foreground elements were placed and filmed in front of a white backdrop. When the positives and negatives of this footage were developed, they gave off different effects. The positives would essentially turn the white background transparent, but the characters and the foliage were completely blacked out, and the negatives had an all blacked out background. They would superimpose the positive of the character footage with normal recorded footage of the dinosaurs in their miniature sets that gave it this silhouetted look. This blacked out area is then filled in with footage of the characters and foliage in the foreground on a second run through the printer, completing the effect. When it's all finished, you have something that looks like this. And then you have the live action set pieces, which were also pretty complex. Some of the ones, including shots of the jungle sequences towards the beginning of the expedition to the plateau, were actually shots of the Los Angeles River. For the London sequences later in the film, they actually recreated a full-scale London street in the studio. This set spanned over 600 feet, included several prop vehicles like cars and buses, and held 2,000 extras for the day of shooting for that particular scene. And finally, there's the ape-man suit that was made for Bull, Montana. The suit was designed by the king of the gorillas himself, Charles Gomorrah. Gomorrah was primarily known for being Hollywood's go-to gorilla suit man, whether he was wearing them, designing them, or both. Gomorrah was originally born in the Philippines, and like a lot of people we've talked about here today, he had an interest in art at an early age. However, he wasn't happy in his home country, and stowed away on a ship heading towards America when he was a teenager. Once he got to San Francisco, he found work at a fruit and later dairy farm to keep him afloat. It wasn't until he won an art contest in 1922 when he realized this could be a possible career for him. With this, he moved to Hollywood and landed his first job in the industry as an extra for 1923's The Hunchback of Notre Dame. When it was noticed he was artistically inclined, he was upgraded to the makeup department. There, he had plenty of work come his way, including being asked to help with the Ape Man's design for the then upcoming Lost World picture. Basically, every aspect of this film was carefully thought out to make it as top tier as films back then could look. Even the lighting for the dinosaur animation sequences were placed in very specific positions to avoid any kind of inconsistencies with how they're exposed to the models. Specifically, Cooper Hewitt lights were used and were placed 2 yards from the miniature sets during filming. The time spent on this film was more than what was usually spent on films during this time. It got to the point where First National had to create a second unit ran by another director, William Dowling, in order to speed up production. The film would enter its full-scale production by 1923. At this point, all of the dinosaur models and sets were complete, the film's cast were selected, and the script was fully finished. And speaking of the script, there were a lot of aspects to it that ended up being pretty different from the final product. Despite how successful The Lost World would end up becoming, during its production, there were still doubts on the dinosaur animation sequences specifically. Using animations like that to this extent for a full feature-length film, it was a risk, and one that some figures on set weren't willing to take. One of these people was Marion Fairfax. Part of the pre-production phase was finding the right cast of people to play the on-screen depictions of the characters featured in Doyle's novel. One of the most memorable roles in The Lost World was, of course, Wallace Beery as contentious scientist Professor George Edward Challenger. Joining him on the roster were Lloyd Hughes as the eager and love-struck reporter Edward Malone, Arthur Hoyt as Challenger's stubborn rival Professor Summerlee, who, fun fact, was the older brother of the movie's director Harry O. Hoyt, Bessie Love as Paula White, a newly added character that's not from the book to give the movie a romantic subplot, Lewis Stone as the adventurous Lord John Roxton, and Bull Montana as the Ape-Man, both of whom were actually originally part of William Selig's cast list when he was conceptualizing his version of The Lost World years prior. With the cast selected and the sets ready, so was the film's production phase. What was also ready was the script made by screenplay writer Marion Fairfax. Born on October 24, 1875, Fairfax began her career in entertainment by acting in and then eventually writing for Broadway plays between 1901 and 1915. Her transition into motion pictures came shortly after when she began writing screenplays for films like The Immigrant, The Primrose Ring, On the Level, and so much more. In fact, The Lost World isn't actually her first screenplay of a Conan Doyle story. She would actually help write the 1922 film adaptation of Sherlock Holmes that was produced by Goldwyn Pictures. Then, in 1921, she established her own film production company simply called Marion Fairfax Productions, where they began to produce and direct their own pictures before a couple of years later, she was given the opportunity to write The Lost World. So she wrote a script that was both faithful to the original novel, but also included elements fit for a cinematic experience. That being said, the original script had some major differences to it from the final film. While O'Brien's dinosaurs were intended to be the main part of the story, there was some doubt from First National for how successful O'Brien's animation technique would be. So to reassure the higher-ups, Fairfax wrote a script with what some sources have claimed to be enough material so that if O'Brien's stop-motion dinosaur animations didn't work, the dinosaurs could be easily written out of the story. I can only assume this backup plan was put in place because stop motion at this point was still a newer medium, especially to use in a feature-length film. That in itself posed a huge risk for the movie's production, which only increases when you take consideration in the time and money that was put into it. If the dinosaur scenes ended up looking too poor in quality, then they would basically have no film. So just in case, Fairfax wrote an adventure story that included a cannibal subplot that could essentially be used in replacement of the dinosaurs. So that way, they at least still had a movie to push out if the dinosaur sequences failed. And while the film didn't end up going this route, existing still images of these scenes prove that they were still filmed, just not used. And as far as I know, these scenes are still lost today. But the original script for The Lost World would eventually be preserved in the form of a 1993 book titled The Lost World of Willis O'Brien by Roy Kinnard. The script still bears many similarities to the final product that we would end up getting, but there were also several differences as well. The script starts with the opening credits fading in and out in front of a primeval jungle. Between the title and credits, a man appears on screen in front of the jungle. According to the script itself, this man is supposed to be John Roxton, who stares out at the jungle in awe and wonder before a trachodon emerges on screen as well, browsing above the treetops. Roxton then disappears behind a tree as the trachodon continues. This whole time, the credits continue and finish rolling, before the scene fades out and a new scene fades in, introducing us to the original novel's author, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, sitting at his desk smiling and writing before we cut to our first text card, which recites, "I have wrought my simple plan, if I give 1 hour of joy to the boy who's half a man, or the man who's half a boy." When it cuts back to Doyle, he continues writing and then it fades to the next scene, as if he's beginning to tell us his story. We fade to London and are introduced to Edward Malone and Gladys Hungerford, whose story plays out similar to the final movie. So to avoid sounding repetitive, I'm only going to focus on the differences between this version of the script and the final cut of the film, since I plan to cover the movie in this video anyways. There's a lot of little differences that play out in the first act of the film. For example, in the beginning of the film when Malone is at the London Record Journal attempting to acquire a dangerous assignment, he's told about the infamous Professor Challenger and how much he despises reporters, before showing a few of Challenger's victims, bruised up and bandaged as a result of his wrath. While this scene doesn't show up in the final film, a still of it does survive today, indicating that it was likely filmed and either wasn't used or is one of the many scenes still lost today. When Malone is at the lecture and reveals himself to be a reporter to Challenger, the scientist chases him out of the meeting room and into the museum, where Malone barely slips away from Challenger's grasp, climbs up a mammoth skeleton, runs along its backbone, and slides down its tusk aimed straight towards the door where he makes his grand escape. A couple of stills of this scene survive today, one with Malone getting ready to climb the skeleton display, which is shown to actually be the Brontosaurus skeleton instead of a mammoth, and another of either Malone or Lloyd Hughes' stunt double on the very top of the skeleton, though it's hard to tell who it is since the face is out of frame. There's also a very amusing scene that plays out at Challenger's house when Malone is trying to convince him to let him go on his next expedition. In the final cut, he sneaks into Challenger's house, but in this version, he knocks on the door and Challenger's butler, Austin, answers it. They exchange some word before Malone is allowed inside and the door closes. For a few moments, we're kept on an outside shot of Challenger's home, before Malone is suddenly thrown out the window by Challenger himself. Honestly, they should have kept that one in. That would have been hilarious to see. The next major difference is an entire farewell sequence where the Amazon expedition is seen off on their adventure. Gladys says goodbye to Malone, and Malone's boss, McArdle, is also there to iron out the last bit of details regarding the trip if he is to finance it. That being the condition that Roxton is their leader and not Challenger, to which Roxton eventually agrees to. The script had also incorporated a part from the novel where Challenger, who's joined on the expedition with his butler Austin, would leave the group to travel to South America on their own with a letter of instructions that they were not to open until a specific time at their destination. Once they reach the South American outpost, they wait for that exact time and open Challenger's letter, which reveals a blank piece of paper. Realizing they can't go further without Challenger and his maps, the disappointed group are prepared to cut their losses before the professor suddenly shows up, revealing that he tricked the group to prove why he's the actual leader of the expedition, because they would otherwise be lost without him. In the next scene, our characters are traveling down one of the Amazonian rivers heading to the plateau by canoe. Here, we're introduced to Zambo, who leads a group of bearers and a pack of dogs in one of the canoes, one of whom is Gomez, a character from the original book that was originally incorporated into this film adaptation but ended up being cut out. But not entirely. In fact, Gomez can actually be seen in the final cut of 1925's The Lost World. According to the script, Gomez is sitting behind Malone on one of the canoes, trying to peek at his documents on the typewriter much to Malone's irritation. Well, if you look back on the canoe scene of the film, the version I'm using as an example is the 2017 Blu-ray version, you can actually see Gomez's character for a very brief moment. Funnily enough, he's actually played by Bull Montana as well, who again is also the ape man in the film. Just like in the book, Gomez is treated very much like a villain with clear implications that he is malintentioned, but the expedition are too busy on their own adventure to put their full focus on him. And soon, the canoes reach a point of tall reeds of grass that Challenger marked as his doorway into the unknown. They paddle their canoes through the narrow channel in between the reeds and make it out to more open waters. And as the group continues, we slowly fade to a night scene within the jungle. As the music changes to the intense beatings of war drums, the camera focuses on a naked Indian native sitting in the middle of a jungle clearing, banging his hands against the hollow drums to make those loud beatings, spreading a message to his fellow tribe members. That message reaches a second Indian native who's atop a mound of great rocks. He too begins to beat against his drums to continue spreading the message. Meanwhile, the Challenger expedition have found ground to make their base camp and rest up for the evening. At least, they try. They can't help but listen to the distant drum beatings that have followed them for some time now. Challenger reveals they're meant as signals for the Kukuma Indians. As the drums continue, one of the bearers heads towards the stream to collect some water in his canteen. Along with him, one of the dogs also takes a drink from the stream before suddenly he starts barking and growling at something from the other side of the brook. Though he can't see anything in the dark jungles across the water, the bearer slowly lowers his canteen on the ground and reaches for his gun. Before he knows it, one of the natives appears on the other side, holding a long bow and an arrow tipped with poison pointed at the bearer. The native then releases the arrow and strikes the bearer right on his shoulder. His yells attract the rest of the camp, who become concerned at the prospect of being hunted by the cannibal natives. So Ed and Roxton decide to scout the area much to Paula's dismay. Her worries cause Challenger to go with them, unknowing of the mutiny that's being formed by Gomez and the other bearers. The three men find the cannibals and witness some of their native ritual dancing before heading back to camp. When they arrive, they discover Austin, Summerlee, Zambo, and Paula tied up and gagged, the camp ransacked of its resources, and all of the bearers gone along with their canoes. Zambo had gotten it the worst, as his arm was struck by one of the machetes of the bearers when he attempted to prevent them from taking the canoes. This actually explains why his arm was in a sling for most of the finished movie, as Roxton had bandaged him up during the sequence that would ultimately be cut. Despite the setback, the group pushed forward towards the plateau, eventually setting up camp near its base. Meanwhile, the cannibals discover their old camp, investigating everything that was left behind and noticing the canoes were no longer at the riverbank. Believing the expedition had cut their losses and left to go back home, the cannibals then turned their attention on the dead bear that they had successfully killed earlier, with the film fading out on a disturbing implication. And that's pretty much it as far as the cannibal subplot goes. Everything from this point on is pretty much included in the final film. There are minor differences. More of an emphasis is placed on Malone's and Paula's romance. Some of the dinosaur sequences that were in the movie were not present in the script, like the T-Rex and Agathamus fight, and there's an instance or two of dinosaur sequences that were written out in the script that didn't make the final cut. One example was a really interesting sequence that was to play out during the volcano eruption scene, where Malone is trying to retrieve the two scientists back to the caves while the jungle is up in flames. Fire raging all about. Many of the monsters have refuge in the water, others are arriving. The Allosaurus comes crashing out of the woods and wades far out into the water. All are nervous, too much disturbed by the fire to attack each other except a nip here and there. As soon as the Allosaurus is well out in the lake, the pterodactyl sweeps in over the treetops and lights on the far margin of the lake, close to the pool that leads up to the cave. This shot, with the fire raging, the aggregation of grotesque monsters, the reflections in the water, etc., should suggest something out of Dante's Inferno, with the pterodactyl for the devil. Also, it must look as if Ed and the scientist would never be able to reach the cave. This is followed with the scene of the pterodactyl standing in the way between the cave entrance and Ed and the scientists, before wandering away and picking a fight with another animal as the trio make a run for the pole that leads up to safety. The script also includes a brief sequence after the group gets off the plateau, where they're transporting the brontosaurus that had fallen off the cliff by cage sitting on top of a big raft that's somehow still floating and is being paddled by bearers, presumably towards the coastal region to be then transported to London. And in the movie's big finale, originally meant to take place on the Hungerford Bridge, it was initially going to feature a whole cavalry of police officers, foot guards, and horse guards with machine guns propped up and aimed at the runaway dinosaur on the other end of the bridge. All of the main characters were to play a more active role in this finale, as they would hop into abandoned cars on the street to chase after the brontosaurus and arrive just in time to stand between it and the firing squad who were given the orders to take the dinosaur out. These cut sequences with the dinosaurs certainly proved to be a lot more eventful than whatever they had planned with the cannibal subplot. Despite the main reason for this subplot being cut was because the dinosaur scenes proved to be more than exceptional, I would also believe this footage was cut because the subplot was pretty much filler, as everything I mentioned about it in this book was the extent of the quote-unquote conflict between the Challenger expedition and the cannibal tribe, if you can even call it that since there was no real encounter. As I said before, this subplot was often considered to be the backup plan in case O'Brien's dinosaur animation footage ended up being unusable. Though with how uneventful and short the sequence is, I question if this was really the case, especially since one source I found, which was Roy Pilot's Lost World commentary track on the 2001 DVD release of the movie, claimed that Fairfax had enough material to work with if O'Brien's dinosaur animations didn't work. But in the original script, the main expedition don't even come face to face with the cannibals, let alone there being enough material to compensate for O'Brien's dinosaur animations. Regardless of what its purpose was, it wouldn't have done much for the story of the Lost World, as the reason why the film was to be made at all is because it was planned to include realistic dinosaur animations. Anything less would have undoubtedly harmed the film's structure and goals, and definitely wouldn't have made it as notable as it's considered to be nowadays. So really, it's a good thing the cannibal subplot was dropped. That being said, evidence of the subplot can still be seen in the final cut of the film. The subplot not only explains Zambo's injury from earlier, but it also explains why the group was being stalked by a native near the riverbank during their trip on the canoes that's never shown again. And the book that preserves the original script even lists Chris Penn Martin as a cast member who was to play both a bearer and a cannibal in the sequences that were ultimately cut. As far as where these sequences are now, they're still unfortunately lost. While they definitely didn't need to be in the final cut of the film, it would still be cool to see the deleted scenes released in a different format, maybe as a special feature for a hard copy release of The Lost World if it ever gets found. Though that is a long shot because as far as I know, they've yet to be uncovered. This does beg the question, however, what did the final cut of The Lost World look like? Now that we've covered pretty much the entirety of The Lost World's development history, including all of the drama, production, and everything else in between, we can finally get to the movie itself. For reasons that I plan to cover in one of the future segments of this video, several portions of the Lost World for the longest time were considered lost. However, thanks to preservation efforts that had spanned for several years, the current most complete version of The Lost World was released in 2017 by film restoration and distribution company Flicker Alley. This version has a runtime of 1 hour and 44 minutes, and it's the version that I'm going to use to summarize the final product of the movie. But I do plan to talk about all of the other versions of the movie later on, as there are just so many of them. Without further ado, this is 1925's The Lost World. We start our film with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who recites his short poem, "I have wrought my simple plan, if I give 1 hour of joy to the boy who's half a man, or the man who's half a boy." We then cut to London, where we meet reporter Edward Malone, who's come to visit his girlfriend Gladys Hungerford with the intention of proposing to her. But she turns him down as she wants to be with an adventurous and courageous man, and Malone unfortunately doesn't fit that standard. Determined to marry Gladys, Malone goes back to his job at the London Record Journal newspaper in the hopes of securing a dangerous assignment. Instead, he literally falls into the assignment of investigating the infamous Professor Challenger's yarn of prehistoric animals that he's claimed to see on his last expedition to the Amazon rainforest. He's sent to the lecture hall that Challenger is scheduled to be at for that evening, though reporters are banned from the event as Challenger has grown to hate them due to the mockery they've made him out to be in the press. Luckily, Malone sees a familiar face in the form of Sir John Roxton, a famous hunter and adventurer who's a friend of Challenger's and is willing to hear out his story of dinosaurs and mammoths. Roxton is generous enough to get Malone into the lecture, where we meet the professor himself, who's ridiculed and criticized by a large crowd of students, scientists, and even his fellow colleagues. Like Professor Summerlee, the eminent coleopterist, as the film describes him. He announces that while the committee isn't willing to fund any return trips to the Amazon, they are willing to allow Challenger to explain his piece. But Challenger has no intentions of trying to clear his name, but instead attempts to collect volunteers to go with him on his own expedition to the Amazon to prove that dinosaurs do still exist. Summerlee volunteers to take the opportunity to discredit Challenger, as it's his belief that he's nothing more than a liar and a fraud. Roxton then volunteers, presumably for the thrill of venturing to an uncharted region in the Amazon, but he's also going for other reasons that will be explained later. And finally, Malone stands up to volunteer. At first, Challenger accepts him for the expedition, but when Malone reluctantly states his occupation as a reporter, all hell breaks loose, as Challenger chases him out of the museum. Malone successfully escapes, and from there, Challenger goes home, not realizing that the reporter had hitched a ride on the back of his taxi. Malone is determined to go on this expedition, to the point where he literally breaks into Challenger's home to try and convince him to let him go, which has to be one of the worst ways to approach this. But it ends up working in Malone's favor. This leads to a scuffle that's taken outside and is broken up by an officer, who sides with Malone's story. But Malone doesn't press charges against Challenger, which is enough for the scientist to invite the young reporter back in. Around the same time, Roxton pays a visit to Challenger's house as well, and being fully aware of the trip they're going to embark on, alludes to a mysterious diary that Malone knows nothing about. Challenger then explains the diary belonged to a colleague of his, Maple White, and within the diary were writings and illustrations of prehistoric beasts that he allegedly encountered on a plateau that's never been explored by modern people. Challenger also introduces Malone to White's daughter, Paula White, who was with him on this expedition, but due to being ill, was left behind at the base camp while her father traversed the uncharted region. Despite this, they had encountered some of the prehistoric animals that roamed the plateau, scaring off the rest of the expedition, leaving White behind. Not knowing where else to go, Paula sought help from Challenger, who's yet to find the funds for a rescue trip. But Malone suggests that the Record Journal newspaper could fund the trip in exchange for having exclusive publication rights to their story. Challenger's reluctant at first, but for the sake of Paula and her father, agrees to the plan. The scene ends with Roxton showing not so subtle signs that a large part of why he's going on the trip is because he has a thing for Paula. With that, the group is off to the Amazon rainforest. Once they get to their final outpost of civilization, the rest of the trip is made by boat through the river. Accompanying them is Jocko the monkey, who's good at distinguishing what vegetation is poisonous or safe to eat. Also joining them is Zambo, an African-American bear that's unfortunately portrayed by actor Jules Cowles in blackface. Zambo also featured in the original book, and while admittedly he wasn't portrayed very tastefully in that either, he was a lot more competent there than his movie counterpart, who's a lot more dopey and cartoony. Unfortunately, blackface back then was just something that was more socially acceptable to portray in film. Going back to the movie, the group finally reach the bottom of the plateau and establish a base camp. Little do they know, they're being watched from atop the plateau by a creepy looking ape man and his chimp companion, who knock down a boulder straight onto their campsite. Before the group can do anything about their monkey business, Roxton spots their first prehistoric reptile, a pterodactyl carrying a barely living toxodon carcass to the top of the rock structure adjacent to the plateau. Seeing White's accounts to be true only pushes the expedition forward, and the following day they reach the top of the adjacent rock structure to cut down the tree to use as their bridge to this new world. However, the commotion gets the attention of a nearby brontosaur, and as soon as the group make it across the tree log, the curious dinosaur tries to eat its leaves, inadvertently dislodging it and causing it to fall, leaving our characters stuck on the plateau. With nothing else to do, the characters set up camp, and what follows are pretty much a series of random dinosaur encounters, most of which are disconnected from our characters. The first sequence features an Allosaurus attacking a Trachodon. The two dinosaurs become locked in battle before the Allosaur takes a chunk of flesh out of the Trachodon's neck. The Allosaur then moves on to a nearby group of Triceratops, one of which defends her young against the intruding carnivore and successfully drives it away. Luckily, the group remains unharmed, but just when the environment begins to die down, the group experience their first direct contact with the dinosaurs. A Tyrannosaurus Rex stalks the group from within the brush, showing off a really creepy visual of just its eyes being visible within the dark woods, before the theropod crashes through the tree line and attacks the camp. The attacker is soon driven away after being shot and even hit with the torch. Unsatisfied with its lack of a kill, the T-Rex then goes off to pick a fight with a nearby Agathomys. The fight leads to the T-Rex getting its stomach ripped open by the Agathomys' horn, a chunk of which being skewered on the horn itself. But the Agathomys' victory is short-lived, as another T-Rex emerges and successfully brings down the horned dinosaur and even eats chunks of it while it's still alive. At one point, as the Agathomys is trying to get up, the T-Rex jumps on it and even digs its back claws into its belly, putting it down for good. And as if that wasn't enough for it, the T-Rex then jumps towards a passing pterodactyl and kills it as well. More than anything, this part of the scene was likely just a way to showcase the sophistication of the special effects, having the T-Rex model jump up in the air by itself on top of all the other things that it's been shown to do. Meanwhile, Malone climbs up to the top of a tree in order to get a better look at their surroundings, not realizing he's being followed by the ape man. Luckily, Roxton notices just in time and shoots the intruder, causing him to fall on the ground and skitter away from the camp. While Malone was in the tree, he noticed a cave entrance by a rockside mountain on a different region of the plateau, which is where they set off to make their next camp. In the days that follow, the group make themselves comfortable in their new home, as well as exploring the caves in the hopes of finding Paula's father, as it's possible he too sought refuge in these caves away from the deadly dinosaurs. From here, the group splits off to do their own things. Paula and Malone come to accept the possibility of never getting off the plateau and decide to marry each other. The professors decide to observe a wandering brontosaurus, and Roxton explores the caves and finds the remains of Paula's father, Maple White. However, he also finds an opening that leads partway down the plateau. From this opening, he's able to get the attentions of Austin and Zambo, who have been devising their own plan to help their trapped colleagues. Their plan is to send Jocko up the wall of the plateau with a long string tied to his body. The other side of the string is tied to a rope ladder Zambo and Austin put together. All they need to do is pull up the rope ladder and climb the rest of the way down the plateau. The last thing to do is to have Paula lure Jocko up the plateau, as he'll go anywhere she's at. When Roxton meets back up with Malone and Paula to update them on what he's found, he sees their embrace and realizes that his chances with Paula could be over. But he puts on a brave face, asks Malone to round up the professors, and breaks the news to Paula about her father. As this is happening, the professors observe the lone brontosaur grazing before being threatened by an attacking T-Rex. This leads to the famous battle scene between the two behemoths that's forever immortalized in dinosaur film history. As the two giants clash, the professors can only watch in awe and terror from the sidelines. The fight gets closer and closer to the plateau's edge, but neither of the two beasts show any sign of stopping. It is not until the brontosaurus slips off the edge and falls into the water at the bottom of the cliff when the fight reaches its end. The injured T-Rex stumbles away, but the professors aren't out of the woods yet, quite literally, as the volcano that sits atop the plateau begins to smoke. This leads to the film's most effects-heavy sequence that features a stampede of the plateau's many dinosaurs running away from the eruption. It's honestly really cool to see so many dinosaurs portrayed on screen like this, as most dinosaur movies after The Lost World became more minimal in their rosters. Also, I just love how the Brachiosaurus run in this movie. They look so funny. In the middle of the chaos is Malone desperately trying to find the professors to take them back to the caves, all while Roxton and Paula anxiously wait for their arrival. Soon, we fade into the next scene, which features the aftermath of the devastating eruption. Luckily, our character survived, and even managed to get Jocko up the plateau wall to deliver the rope to pull up the ladder. One by one, the group make their descent down the ladder, with Malone being the final one. Though, one last interference by the ape man nearly causes him to fall to his death, as he tries to pull the rope back up towards the cave. However, the ape man is finally put down by Roxton, who lands a shot on him from below. With that, the group are finally off the plateau. However, being back to their own world means being back with their former obligations. Paula, unwilling to break apart Malone's promise to Gladys, rejects his proposal, to his dismay. But the expedition doesn't leave completely empty-handed. At the bottom of the plateau, they pass by the Brontosaurus that fell off earlier after its fight with the Tyrannosaurus Rex, which was now stuck in the mud of a swamp. Once they realize their opportunity, plans are made to bring the dinosaur back to London with them. Sometime later, the group is back home, at the same museum and lecture hall that brought the expedition together to show off to the world that dinosaurs still do exist. However, things don't go as planned. As Challenger is hyping up his discovery to the crowd, he gets a frantic call from Malone telling him the cables carrying the animal's cage off the ship snapped, with the fall breaking the cage open. The animal was now loose in the streets of London. The Brontosaurus, acting more like a startled animal than a vicious monster, wanders around the city, knocking over crowds with its long tail, curiously inspecting some of London's many sights, and knocking them down in the process, and crashing through buildings. The animal makes its way to the London Bridge, which is unable to support its weight, causing it to crumble from under it, sending the Brontosaurus into the River Thames. The animal remains unharmed, and begins its long swim, presumably back to its home in South America. After the commotion, Malone meets with Gladys, finding out that she had moved on with someone else. Luckily, this means Malone's obligations to her are severed, and in a very bittersweet moment, even though it looks like Paula was maybe going to start something with Roxton, he lets her go when he sees she clearly still wants to be with Malone. The film ends with Malone and Paula going off to get married, while Challenger sits at the bridge, watching his greatest discovery swim away from their modern world. On February 2nd of 1925, The Lost World would make its film debut at the Tremont Temple Theater in Boston, Massachusetts. Its screening would go on for an indefinite amount of time, and the cost of admissions were $1 per ticket. About a week later, it featured in the Astor Theater in New York City. According to an article by the Moving Picture World that was published shortly before the movie's release, production and editing have now been completed on this production. The finished picture has been run off for the officials of the company and representatives of Watterson R. Rothacker, in association with whom the production has been made. They are unanimous in proclaiming The Lost World to be the greatest novelty and the biggest motion picture ever produced. The Lost World would go on to be a box office success. Despite Rothacker wanting to push the movie's budget towards $1 million, it seems he only got it as far as $700,000 by the end of production, which isn't anything to shy away from. In the 1920s, a $700,000 budget for a major motion picture was huge, and in the end, they would make back $1.3 million. This was largely due to all of the fun and widespread marketing they did for the film before its release. The Lost World's name was everywhere. It was in the papers, it was on trucks. Banners were on carriages being pulled by horses. They made several dinosaur floats that they would parade around town. International theaters in France and Japan had big displays of dinosaurs to celebrate the movie's release. Merchandise in the form of a puzzle and a toy called the Twist-'em Baby Dinosaur were being sold. There was even a donkey being walked around Paris carrying a sign that said, "All the world has seen the Lost World except for me because I am a donkey." In the 1993 documentary Dinosaur Films, Forrest J. Ackerman, co-founder and editor of the Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine, reminisced when The Lost World came out when he was a kid and the fun experience he had with the film and its marketing.
You cannot imagine how exciting it was to be 8 or 9 years old and see 49 dinosaurs on the screen for the first time in your life. It had been nothing like it previously. I say it was, although it was totally silent, I think it was augmented by lots of screams in the audience. And there was a theater down in Los Angeles, downtown, that no longer exists. But before you went into the theater, there was a model of a Brontosaurus about so size, and it was actually breathing. I guess they had an air pump there that was making the stomach go up and down. I've often wondered what in the world became of that model. It would have been real grand to have in a museum.
This marketing was very successful, and in some cases, maybe too successful. If the box office wasn't enough to convince you of The Lost World's success, I even ran into a couple of alleged reports that stated it was so crowded at the Astor Theater in New York, police had to get involved to control the crowd and empty the lobby twice, only to have to call for reserves a little after 9 later that night when the lobby once again became overcrowded. So yeah, suffice to say, The Lost World was a pretty big deal back then. Soon after its release, reviews also came in, and as you'd expect, the dinosaurs were the most praised aspect. The moving picture world managed to record some of these reviews in an article of theirs published on February 21st of 1925. To list a few of these reviews, George Gerhardt of the Evening World stated, "The Lost World revealed itself as a truly great endeavor. This picture is an entirely new departure in the cinema art. It is a marvel of ingenuity, bringing to the screen, as it does, gigantic prehistoric animals extinct for millions of years, in such a manner that the spectator absolutely lives the story from beginning to end. How the animals were made to appear so lifelike is an absolute mystery. No words short of stupendous and marvelous will measure up to a description of some of its scenes. The cast is one of the best appearing on Broadway in many a month." Rose Pelswick from the Journal had stated, "Enough to make anyone vote for prohibition. Strong men clutched their escorts' hands as a pterodactyl flapped its wings and took a bow. Weak women shrieked at the sight of the unpronounceable dinosaurs. You'll get a great kick out of the picture. It's entertaining and imaginatively produced." Mordaunt Hall wrote for The Times saying, "Through wonderful photographic skill and infinite patience in the camera work, The Lost World makes a memorable motion picture. A unique production which will cause a lot of talk, as some of the scenes are as awesome as anything that has ever been shown in shadow form. It also has been fashioned with keen sense for comedy relief." Regina Cannon from the Evening Graphic wrote, "The Lost World opened to an audience that sat in breathless suspense. The picture is most extraordinary. After that, it is also stupendous, original, and... but what's the use trying? Words are inadequate to describe just how breathtaking is this miracle of photography. The thing that makes The Lost World the most unusual bit of photoplay ever imagined is the marvelous photography. This must be seen to be appreciated. See The Lost World and get the thrill of a lifetime." The bulk of the movie's criticisms came from people who were mainly unimpressed with the human story elements. The New York Times described the film as memorable, though was, in their words, weakened by some subtitles and the unnecessary inclusion of countless protestations of affection by both the hero and the heroine at inopportune moments. But even reviews like these still gave praise to the film's animated dinosaur sequences. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle even gave his seal of approval when he went to go watch the film for the first time in theaters with his 3 children, his 2 sons and his daughter. Curious to hear about their initial impressions, Roy Pilot had actually contacted Doyle's daughter, Jean Conan Doyle, in the early 90s, and according to him, she had responded and stated that her father was very pleased with the film, and that they both very much enjoyed the dinosaur animations.
Conan Doyle had an opportunity to view this movie with his family in 1925, and his family at that time consisted of his daughter, Jean, and his 2 sons, Adrian and Dennis. I was curious myself as to whether there was any reaction from Dame Jean Conan Doyle, so I wrote to her in the early 1990s. She indicated how pleased her father was with the film and how he enjoyed the animations. She herself recalls the animations and the wonderment of the dinosaurs and thought it was a fun film.
The Lost World was huge, and it was a critical and financial success. And this success continued well after its initial release. About a year later, on February 4th, 1926, The Lost World continued making waves by then holding the record for being the first airline film, as it was selected by the German Air Service Company to feature during a flight to Berlin. And over the years, it would become recognized as being a very important and influential film. So much so that in 1998, it was added to the National Film Registry for being culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant to film history. The Lost World's influence to the film industry is so vast that it's genuinely hard to imagine where we would be had it never been made. It's because of its innovations in special effects that have caused filmmakers and artists to further break new grounds in how they can make the impossible a reality. If dinosaurs could be brought to life, what else could they accomplish? O'Brien wanted to continue testing his animation skills out after the success of The Lost World. In the following 4 years after The Lost World's release, O'Brien continued working with First National, conceiving more ideas for fantasy and science fiction films, including one called Atlantis. which was to be a fantasy adventure story set in subterranean caverns housing an ancient civilization that domesticated white-furred mammoths in fields of ice that they controlled, and battled dinosaur-like sea serpents near their underwater empires. Atlantis was meant to be a sort of spiritual sequel to The Lost World, another film that was to push the boundaries of special effects even farther, but after a few months of work, the film would be cancelled. The same fate would happen to O'Brien's film rendition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, where there were plans to put a man in a suit for close-up shots, but have animated sequences for long shots that could display Frankenstein's abilities in ways that weren't possible for human actors to accomplish. However, the tides in the industry were shifting. First National would eventually be purchased by Warner Brothers, who simply didn't have the same visions O'Brien did and wanted to stick with films that were safe for the time, like romance. They essentially considered The Lost World to be lucky in its success, and anything else like it would be too expensive to make. O'Brien moved on from the company to seek other studios that might more appreciate his insights. That's around the time he would be employed by a studio called Radio Keith Orpheum, or RKO for short. Undoubtedly, they recognized O'Brien's achievements with his involvement in The Lost World, and likely wanted a piece of that kind of success for themselves. So they allowed him to at least go back to making the Explorers vs. Dinosaur fantasy film he was best known for. This would lead to the idea of a new film called Creation that he would work on with Harry O. Hoyt, which was to be similar to The Lost World in that travelers would uncover an uncharted region of land that houses prehistoric life. The story behind Creation is a long one, and I'm not going to get into it in detail here, because this material could be better explained in its own video, a possible sequel to this one, since Creation and its failed development would ultimately lead to O'Brien's best-known contribution to the film industry, 1933's King Kong. King Kong would go on to be the quintessential monster movie that would inspire most of the monster movies that you see today, and it's all thanks to all of the tropes, structures, and story elements that The Lost World established. Explorers venturing to a region untouched by modern man, the cinematic battles between giant prehistoric beasts, the inclusion of a romance between one of the explorers and a love interest character, the dinosaurs of various geological time periods coexisting together on one landmass, and of course, the capturing of one of the inhabitants of the Lost World to bring back to the modern world, only for it to escape and wreak havoc. Without the Lost World, there simply wouldn't be a King Kong. At least not the one that we know today. And that's evident from the fact that it borrows so much from its 1925 predecessor. In fact, to ensure all of their bases were covered, RKO purchased the rights to The Lost World for $10,000 in May of 1932 from Warner Brothers, who had obtained them when they merged with First National in 1929. The reason why RKO did this is because they realized the many similarities their upcoming Ape movie had with O'Brien's previous film. But regardless of this, King Kong would perfect a lot of the elements that The Lost World introduced in a monster fantasy epic. And those tropes and clichés would continue to be passed down in many monster movies and, more specifically, dinosaur movies for decades to come. In fact, The Lost World shaped a lot of what dinosaur pop culture history would end up becoming. The most popular way to bring dinosaurs into the modern world in film during this era was using the Lost World method. This includes Unknown Island, Two Lost Worlds, Lost Continent, The Land Unknown, The Valley of Guanji, and so on. And the most famous and important of these examples is, of course, 1933's King Kong, which in turn inspired so many other monster movies. Ray Bradbury attributes The Lost World as being the film that started his fascination with dinosaurs, which would lead to his famous short stories like A Sound of Thunder and of course The Foghorn. This is significant because this short story is often considered to be the inspiration for the atomic age dinosaur film 1953's The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. Along with that, the stop motion featured in both The Lost World and King Kong would inspire animator and artist Ray Harryhausen, who would go on to become O'Brien's protege. Under his influence, Harryhausen would become an exceptional stop motion animator for many well-known films like Jason and the Argonauts, 20 Million Miles to Earth, It Came from Beneath the Sea, 1 Million Years BC, Valley of Guanji, and most notably to dinosaur film history, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. The atomic age messaging within the film, along with its main dinosaurian monster, would inspire one of, if not the most well-known monster film to date, 1954's Godzilla, which would in turn launch a whole new era of kaiju films and shows, including Mothra, Rodan, Ultraman, Gamera, Yongari, and so many others that I'm not going to bother listing because it would take too long. The advent of the giant monster on the run movies would inspire other dinosaur kaiju films like The Giant Behemoth, Reptilicus, and Gorgo, which had familiar sequences reminiscent to that of the Brontosaurus rampage scene in The Lost World. King Kong was so well received, it would be re-released to theaters and re-aired on TV several times over the years, which would be caught by people who would fall in love with the medium of stop motion. One of these people was Phil Tippett, who would do the stop-motion sequences for very iconic films like the original RoboCop and the original Star Wars trilogy. But his love for the Lost World and prehistoric animal aspects of the film led him to contribute his skills in films like The Crater Lake Monster, and even his own 10-minute dinosaur short film from 1985 called Prehistoric Beast, titled after the iconic lines delivered by Denham's character in the original film.
What do you call this thing? Why, something from the dinosaur family. Dinosaur, eh? Yes, Jack. A prehistoric beast.
King Kong would also be given multiple adaptations over the years too, and probably would have been given more if its film rights weren't a complete mess. But that's a story for a different video. One huge fan of King Kong is film director Peter Jackson, who's responsible for blockbuster films like the Lord of the Rings franchise, the Hobbit franchise, and of course, 2005's King Kong. Being a fan of the original film, it was Jackson's dream to remake it one day, and he eventually would after a long and tedious development history which led to the 2005 remake. And of course, King Kong would also inspire the most famous dinosaur movie franchise of all time, 1993's Jurassic Park. Steven Spielberg has even stated before that King Kong was the reason why he wanted to make Jurassic Park.
My one precedent for Jurassic Park was King Kong. King Kong was the high watermark of special effects, creating a world that I never knew existed, especially the great fight between King Kong and the Tyrannosaurus Rex. But as a young person, that scene had no peer, and I think that was my high watermark for imagining what it would be like to do a King Kong of today. But I was so inspired by King Kong, that was one of the reasons I think I wanted to make Jurassic Park.
And what's more, Stan Winston, the man behind the practical effects for the original 3 Jurassic Park movies, provided a text blurb that was featured on the back of the DVD box of the 2001 restoration of The Lost World, stating, "Our creature animation in the Jurassic Park films basically descend from The Lost World of 1925. Willis O'Brien is our great pioneer, and this superb restoration inspires new awe for his imagination and craftsmanship." And of course, the sequel to the Jurassic Park book, The Lost World by Michael Crichton, was a direct nod to Doyle's original book, which, in turn, was used for the film adaptation in 1997, which also uses many of the tropes seen within the original 1925 movie, including the whole monster on the run Tyrannosaurus sequence towards the end. Jurassic Park marked a new era of dinosaur films, essentially accomplishing the same level of realism The Lost World did for its time. Spielberg and his team were focused on making the dinosaurs as realistic as possible, utilizing modern paleontology and modern tech to bring them to life. And it was such a success that it would spawn a whole new wave of dinomania that not only led to an abundance of more dinosaur films, of varying quality, but it would also come full circle, as it would be this trend that would reignite interest to preserve the Lost World, which is why we now have its most complete version today. I'll get into that story in the next segment. Like The Lost World had done for dinosaur films for decades prior to Spielberg's blockbuster, Jurassic Park, and by extension, the now Jurassic World movies, have inspired many of the modern dinosaur films we have today, for better or for worse. Keep in mind, that's just the film industry. That's not even covering what The Lost World has done for other fields like cryptozoology and, more importantly, paleontology. Considering The Lost World is about a scientist being proven right about his claims of alleged prehistoric animals on an isolated landmass, this sparked a whole new wave of interest for people who were believers in such a world. One of these figures included cryptozoologist and creationist Bill Gibbons, who after watching 1925's The Lost World when he was younger, developed an interest in the idea of dinosaurs still existing in some unexplored area of the world. Gibbons' specialty was specifically his research on the Mokele-mbembe, and he would even go as far as launching 2 expeditions to the Congo to search for this mysterious dinosaur, one in the mid-1980s and another in 1992. The Lost World movie would be played for museums to help gain support for South American expeditions, and throughout the years inspired many people to explore and document land regions like Mount Roraima. As far as paleontology goes, The Lost World gave the general public a brand new image on what the dinosaurs really looked like. At the time, the dinosaurs of The Lost World were very scientifically accurate, And what's more, they were shown to be very active and lively. I mentioned it earlier, but a lot of their behaviors and movements were attributed to that of real animals. And in some cases, the dinosaurs were shown to be caring parents, and in other cases, like the Brontosaurus rampage scene, the dinosaur was shown to be more of a confused and curious animal than a monster determined to destroy everything in its path. But as the film industry continued to shift, accurate dinosaur depictions became obscured, and more creative liberties would be taken for how dinosaurs would look in Hollywood productions. That being said, The Lost World, in itself, is a fossil of dinosaur cinema, in that we get a look at a rare perception of dinosaurs at a point in time through the eyes of both science and entertainment. As culturally significant as The Lost World is, for the longest time, the movie was incomplete. The original release ran for a total of 104 minutes. In this original version, the beginning sequence featured Doyle sitting at his desk, preparing to write his novel before looking at the camera and reciting his poem. When he was finished, he would begin writing as if he was starting to tell his story. However, this and many other scenes of this original print would be cut out of the film when it was later sold to Kodascope in 1929. This was the year First National was sold and merged with Warner Brothers Entertainment, and during this transitional period, The Lost World was withdrawn from distribution and was instead sold to Kodascope, a film company that specialized in cutting down feature-length films for the home viewing market. As a result of this purchase, The Lost World's original 104-minute runtime was cut down to be somewhere between 52 and 60 minutes. This version not only cut out the beginning sequence with Doyle, the sequence with Gladys and Malone was also cut, essentially erasing her from the film. The scene of Challenger meeting the group in South America was cut, and portions of the London rampaging scene at the end of the film were also cut. For years, this version of the film was the most complete, and it was only cut down more in 1948 when it was purchased by Encyclopedia Britannica, who were interested in using the dinosaur segments for a more educational-based film that was meant to be shown in schools. The hour-long version from Warner Brothers would be cut down to 15 minutes. While the footage of this version has resurfaced in more recent times, previous claims have alleged that it began with a man dressed as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle in a drawing room who tells the audience the story of Roxton's expedition to the Amazon basin in search of a plateau housing prehistoric animals. Maybe this part of the footage had become lost because it doesn't appear anywhere in these versions. What was apparently included in this version were 8 unique shots that would later be used for preservation purposes. For the time being, the most complete version of the film that could be viewed was the 1929 Kodascope cut. That was until the 1990s, when the advent of Dinomania caused a new interest in preserving the very film that paved the way to this trend. The first version during this time was the LumaVision Laserdisc version, which was basically a polished version of the hour-long edit, but also included a trailer of The Lost World and a commercial for a Lost World puzzle made by Bob Sherman in its special features. This extra footage was discovered in the UCLA Film Archives and apparently contained unique footage that would also be used for later preservation efforts. The biggest contributions came from the George Eastman House, a motion pictures museum that began to collect several portions of the Lost World film that were found in different areas of the world. Some of these materials, including 8 minutes worth of outtakes, were recovered from a stock footage company called Petrified Films, who obtained this footage in a collection that they had purchased from Warner Brothers in 1991. Other pieces of footage were recovered from private collections and even the Library of Congress. But their biggest find was a near-complete print of the film that was in the possession of a National Film Archive in Prague, Czech Republic. The George Eastman House had compiled all of the collected material and restored the film with the help of film preservationist Ed Stratman. Apparently, the restoration cost of the film reached upwards of $80,000. As a result, a fundraiser was ran by the now-defunct website the Dinosaur Interplanetary Gazette, which were ran by paleontology and pop culture dinosaur enthusiasts. I'm not entirely sure how much this fundraiser made, but it did get around 50 donors, and the film would eventually get restored in 1997 after some debates and discourse regarding what should and shouldn't be added to the restored version from the found footage. Despite this, the George Eastman House made the unfortunate decision to only screen the film in exclusive theatrical showings instead of releasing it on home media, much to everyone's dismay, including film preservationist David Shepard. When the George Eastman House refused to release The Lost World, Shepard took it upon himself to locate the same footage materials that the Eastman House found, and put together his own restoration of the film through his company, the Film Preservation Associates, that he then published through the home movie distribution company Image Entertainment in 2001. The story for this restoration began in 1999, when Arte, a European public service channel, wanted to air The Lost World. Shepard, who I guess was working closely with the network at this time, attempted to gain access to the George Eastman House version but was denied. So this prompted him to conduct his own search for the same materials and make an even better restoration of whatever the George Eastman House could offer with their limited screenings. Of course, he wasn't alone in completing this restoration. Other names that contributed was his friend Serge Bromberg, Mathieu Dubosc and Brett Hampton as the editors, Jacques Poitrat, their guy from Lecept Arte, who helped finance the restoration process under the condition that they got to broadcast it if they made a longer version that included music from the Alloy Orchestra, a music ensemble that's dedicated to creating music for silent films. There's also Robert Israel, who compiled and conducted the second score that comprised of 15 musicians. There was a recording engineer, a music editor, and so on. In April of that year, Shepard did an interview with the Dinosaur Interplanetary Gazette explaining the process he went through to complete this restoration. At the time, since the original print had been gone for so long, they had to use several different materials as blueprints to get their restoration as accurate as possible to the original. According to Shepard's statements, the greatest artistic difficulty was in editing and titling the film. We had guides of what the film looked like in 1925, the abridgment of 1929, the 1924 production script, from which many departures were made during filming and editing, several detailed synopses, and the 1925 printed music, which is of course definitive as far as scene order goes, but has no clues as to the exact editing of individual scenes. But even with all of these, and of course the novel, no one knows exactly what all the shots or what all the inner titles actually were. We just decided to make a film that closely followed what we knew of the original production, but that would not betray that the work had been reassembled from fragments and was still incomplete. Using what he had, he pieced together his collected materials as best as he could. As far as what footage he used and where he found them, he stated that he used a 35mm print with checked titles, 4 16mm tinted Kodascope abridgments, all worn, so we wanted to be sure we would have an intact copy of every shot, 2 prints of a one-reel version made as a classroom film by Encyclopedia Britannica, which had 8 unique shots, a 1925 trailer, a demonstration reel apparently prepared for a 1925 meeting of the Society of Motion Picture Engineers, and a 1927 interview film with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, which I reconstructed in 1974 from the original 35mm negative and outtakes. There was also a reel of animation outtakes which were not integrated into the editing, but which are presented as a supplementary video feature. That 1927 interview that Shepard was referring to was one that was conducted by Fox Movietones, and was meant to be a replacement of the still-lost beginning sequence that featured Doyle sitting at his desk ready to write his novel. And another piece of supplementary video that was featured in this DVD is the commentary track by Roy Pilot, who was the author of the book The Annotated Lost World. Unfortunately, some footage wasn't included in this version of the film, including a scene where Paula tends to Jocko after he breaks his leg, explaining why he was so attached to her throughout the film. Apparently, this scene was too fragmented to include into the final cut. Along with this, they also toned down a lot of the racial elements that was originally included for Zambo's character. Regardless, his 2001 DVD restoration would go on to be the most complete version of this film for the next several years, having a total runtime of 93 minutes. According to Roy Pilot in his audio commentary of the film, this put The Lost World as being around 90+% complete for the time. It would take Shepard and his team about 9 months total to complete it, and as a final fuck you to the George Eastman House for not releasing their version, he planned to send them a copy of his DVD restoration of the film. Whether he ended up doing this or not, I don't know, but I sure hope he did because that sounds really funny. But that wasn't the end of the story. As I said earlier when summarizing the film, the version that I used was the 2017 Blu-ray edition. This version's runtime stands at 104 minutes, the same runtime as the original released in 1925, though the film still has its differences. In 2004, a few years after the release of Shepard's DVD restoration of The Lost World, Lobster Films was contacted by a David Adamitis, who had been following some of their film preservation efforts. Adamitis had contacted them to offer some of his collection, which consisted of several old cans of film reel, 4 of which were original film reels of The Lost World. How he obtained this in his collection, I have no idea, but it was such a massive find for Shepard and his team, especially since these reels contained missing footage, the original text cards, and color tints, which was common in silent films during that point in time, though the method was considered to be expensive and eventually phased out over time. What's even more amazing about these reels is that one of them contained footage that had more than one color in frame. That being the T-Rex attack sequence when a torch burning of red and yellow is thrown at it, despite the rest of the sequence being tinted in blue. This was known as the Hand-Schiegel color process, in which aniline dye is added to specific areas of the film print to give off more than one color. As impressive as this find was, if they wanted to use any of it, they'd have to do it for a separate restoration, since there was really no way they could add it to their 2001 version. As the years went by, the advent of 2K digital scanning would inspire the team to take advantage of this new tech, which greatly helped with the preservation process, as it meant they could put together all of the found materials structured similarly to the 35mm nitrate version. Even during this process, they came across even more discovered footage in the form of another trailer with Czech lettering that resided in the Archive of Modern Conflict in London. With all of this new footage, they pieced together a new restoration and even brought back Robert Israel to create a new musical track fitted for this latest version. And in 2017, they distributed the film on Blu-ray through Flickr Alley. This is currently the most updated, longest, and carefully crafted version of 1925's The Lost World that we have. And if I had to recommend any Lost World home media regarding the original film, it would be this one. That being said, it's generally accepted that The Lost World will likely never truly be found. Yes, this version finally obtained enough footage to achieve the film's original duration, but certain scenes like the cannibal subplot and the original beginning with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle are still lost. But these last few decades of searching have led to the discovery of footage that would have otherwise stayed lost. According to the booklet that comes with the 2017 Blu-ray version, another significant find that was made during Shepard's 2001 Lost World restoration was a 2-minute 35mm fragment of dinosaur footage that ended up being the test footage that Doyle would show the Society of American Magicians in the summer of 1922. The footage was found within the collection of filmmaker Robert Youngson. And though it's unknown how he obtained the footage, it's since been archived within the Black Hawk Films collection. It's hard to say whether this footage was used in any of Shepard's restorations since I haven't been able to see it separate from the movie, but I would assume, to some extent, they probably did since there was no mention of preserving it as a special features option, so maybe that indicates it made it into the final cut of the restoration. I could be wrong, but in any case, it's great to know that the first ever piece of film made for The Lost World, even if it was never supposed to be a part of the final cut, has been preserved. And though The Lost World may never be found in its true original form, with all of the efforts put towards its preservation in recent years, it'll never be truly lost either. After publishing The Lost World in 1912, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle would actually go on to make more Professor Challenger stories, one being a novel called The Poison Belt that he released in the following year of 1913. The rest of these stories were made after the release of 1925's The Lost World, which likely reignited his interest in the Challenger character. These stories included the novel The Land of Mist from 1925 and two short stories, When the World Screamed in 1928 and The Disintegration Machine in 1929. Doyle would also continue writing about Sherlock, spiritualism, and short story collections up until his death in 1930. At the age of 71, he died from a heart attack on July 7, 1930 in Crowborough, Sussex, England. After the success of The Lost World, Willis H. O'Brien would continue working in the film industry, producing, or at the very least, supervising special effects for science fiction fantasy films. Some of O'Brien's last contributions were 1959's The Giant Behemoth, 1960's The Lost World, and 1963's It's a Mad, 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 Mad World before his death in 1962. Unfortunately for O'Brien, he had so many different ideas for potential dinosaur, giant ape, and other monster movies that he wanted to bring to life with his stop-motion technique. However, most of them would never see the light of day. These included films like War Eagles, King Kong vs. Frankenstein, his original version of Gwangi, and many more. This was due to many reasons, but the most frequent one had to be the fact that the stop-motion technique was a time-consuming and expensive process for a genre of movies that were eventually seen as schlocky and cheap. However, O'Brien's legacy would live on through other means. O'Brien died at the age of 76 on November 8, 1962 in Los Angeles, California. Herbert M. Dolly maintained an active career in film and theater after his conflict with O'Brien and Rothacker. He would make a series of silhouetted dinosaur films with his friend Tony Sarge. He would direct live-action religious films. He began a traveling marionette show during the early 30s, and had acted in and directed multiple plays, but was mainly associated with the Chatham Community Players, of which he would continue to work with until his death in 1970. He would die of natural causes at the age of 90 on August 15, 1970, in New Providence, New Jersey. It's hard to say for sure what happened to Watterson R. Rothacker after The Lost World. There isn't a whole lot that's been documented on what his later life entailed, at least not anything I could find on the internet or any of the film books I have. According to his Find a Grave profile, he worked as a VP for Paramount Pictures for a time, as well as a VP of a Quigley publishing company and as a government censor of pictures in Los Angeles during World War II. He would pass away on January 25, 1960. After The Lost World, O'Brien would bring Marcel Delgado with him on several other projects, including their unfinished creation film, King Kong, Son of Kong, The Last Days of Pompeii, and Mighty Joe Young. Other notable films that Delgado worked on were The War of the Worlds from 1953, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Dinosaurus, and Fantastic Voyage. He worked all the way up until the late 60s before retiring. On November 26, 1976, he would pass away. For a very brief period after she left the Lost World project, Katherine Curtis attempted to make more films, though didn't seem to have much luck with it since one of them, a biography on Buffalo Bill, not only fell through due to issues behind the scenes, but it would even bankrupt her company, the Katherine Curtis Company, in March of 1926. From here, she would become a radio host during the 30s for a show that was meant to teach women about basic financing, and she founded the Women Investors in America Committee, among other programs dedicated to helping the women of America. Curtis used her platforms to criticize the New Deal program, which made her a rather controversial figure. Along with this, she also became known for her far right-wing views that delve into areas like anti-Semitism, anti-communism, and isolationism. She would pass away in 1955. As mentioned earlier, Harry O. Hoyt was originally planned to join O'Brien in his next big dinosaur film venture after The Lost World, which was to be 1931's Creation. However, when the plans for that film fell through, he continued directing and writing films for many years within the genres of comedies, dramas, and mysteries, and would even continue working on them beyond the silent era. Unfortunately, many of Hoyt's silent films are considered lost. He would pass away on July 29, 1961 at the age of 75. Of course, we can't forget the main stars of the show, the dinosaurs themselves. According to the book A Century of Stop-Motion Animation, some of the dinosaur models from the film were donated to Los Angeles' Museum of Arts and Sciences, where they would be put on display for fans of both dinosaurs and film. Some of these models included the dreaded Brontosaurus that rampaged the streets of London, and the Agathomus that fought off and eventually lost to the Tyrannosaurs earlier in the film. But like most physical movie props, these models had a shelf life, and as the years progressed, to the point where they were eventually sharing the display space with the models of 1933's King Kong, they were showing clear signs of deterioration. This would cause them to be stored in a more suitable area for them, but this would end up being both a blessing and a curse. At some point, the museum had undergone construction as they were adding a new wing to the building, and when they went to install a wall between the two parts of the building, the models were accidentally walled up in the process. Luckily, this happened long after their exhibit would be witnessed by a figure who would go on to become very influential in the world of stop motion, that being the at the time young up-and-comer Ray Harryhausen. Harryhausen was greatly inspired by Willis O'Brien's special effects work in both The Lost World and King Kong. And not only did he go on to become O'Brien's protege, he would also work on his own filmography of projects that would become very important works in the world of film special effects. More recently, when Harryhausen had visited the Los Angeles Museum again, he was greeted with some of the dinosaur models from the Lost World film. The staff had confirmed that efforts had finally been made to retrieve the models that had been trapped within the walls of the museum all these years. However, as far as A Century of Stop-Motion Animation had stated, presumably not all of the models had been rescued, as the two Lost World models that Harryhausen saw on that visit were of an Allosaurus and a Triceratops, not the Brontosaurus and the Agathomus that were originally displayed. Maybe they're still stuck within the walls of the museum to this day. Regardless of what happens to these models, whether they deteriorate, become lost, or even destroyed, they are forever immortalized on screen in the world's first feature-length dinosaur film.